What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Hawks Memory Podcast, hosted by yours truly, David Lee, aka DLee43. Been a minute since we dropped the episode, but been very much so involved in the draft since the Hawks got eliminated. Watched a lot of the playoffs, and using that to inform some of my analysis and recommendations around the playoffs, around the draft. And I figured that with the draft about 23-ish days away, it's time to bring on some people who are more informed than me on the draft. Guys who have been doing this all year, been following the prospects since they were on the junior level, pre-NCAA, pre-international competition, all of that. And so to start off this series, man, I'm happy to bring on my guy, Mohamed. His Twitter is at MCFNBA. Chances are, if you've got any sort of interest in the draft, you've probably seen something he's done. He's putting prospect tapes together, putting together visualizations, data. He merges it all. So I'm really happy to have this conversation with Mohamed. And yeah, how are you doing today, bro?
Hey, thanks so much, Dave, for having me, man. I'm excited, man. Draft season's right around the corner, and I think it's just a period of time in the year where you just get super excited, overthinking about your team, watching the playoffs, and just trying to see, what kind of guys fit on your team. What kind of guys do you think are just gonna be really exciting to watch in the league? So yeah, super excited.
For sure. And I think I want to go ahead and get started with like just the idea of the playoffs, right? And I think like it's been said multiple times, but the NBA is a copycat league.
hmm
And like who's better to like copy than the actual eventual champions? I think OKC's on a pretty clear path to win a chip this season. I respect the Indiana Pacers, but I think OKC is that good of a team.
hmm
And what stood out to me throughout this entire playoff run, really the entire season, is their size, right? And there's a difference between size in a traditional sense, which is, just height and weight. And then there's size in terms when you talk about reach, wingspan. And as I've been doing research throughout this draft, there's been a couple quotes I came across. And one of those was basically saying that height isn't as predictive as NBA as impact as it is like height and wingspan in conjunction, right? So you have to
hmm
consider a prospect standing reach, their ability to cover space. And this OKC Thunder team, I think, has mastered the ability to both defend and play in space. So, like we know, like the NBA is at the highest pace than ever. They're spreading out the floor more than ever. Guys are asked to cover ground more than ever, right? And so OKC's advantage is that they're the lightest team in the NBA. So they're the most agile, the quickest, whatever it may be. They're just 28th in height, but their overall differential between their height and their size differential, which is basically just like their plus wingspan calculation, is the second
hmm
highest in the league. And so what that means is they can play small, get all the benefits of playing small while having the benefits of playing big because they can cover space with their wingspans and standing reach. And I was curious, like especially for you, for those who don't know, Mohamed is a Timberwolves fan. And so that team in particular has some similarities. So I'm curious, like when you've been watching this playoffs, you're seeing teams like the Thunder succeed, the
Yeah.
Wolves in the finals, in the conference finals, even New York. If they're a smaller team, but they still have like a lot of plus wingspan guys. How much of that has impacted the way that you're looking at prospects? And are there any guys that stick out to you that sort of align with that thinking, and guys that like sort of, they're maybe not as fit for that style of basketball?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the draft, I think that I mean not even the draft per se, but more so the NBA playoffs. I think there's a lot of things that are very king. And when you watch the game, when it comes to size, when it comes to rebounding, rim protection, length, perimeter shooting, um, and I think a lot of the connective skills that you look for in prospects. And I think when it comes to this particular class, especially when it comes to seeing how guys fit, you understand that a lot of prospects bring a lot of different kind of archetypes and play styles, and it's really hard to kind of project how those fit into the playoffs until you actually start watching the playoffs and see what kind of guys were really successful, respective to their role, just overall impact on the game on both ends of the floor. And I think being able to kind of look back, pre-draft with their tape and kind of their evaluation and seeing, what was it that prospects got wrong with, or evaluations that people kind of hit the mark on. And I think some things that kind of when I'm looking at prospects right now is I think most importantly the defense. I think when you see the level
Mhm.
of physicality in the playoffs, you really see how demanding and physically taxing the game is. And I think one of the biggest things is when you see prospects, continue to get younger and younger, and the cycle really kind of fall out of touch with, the older prospects and guys that, really bring the classic physicality and strength into their game. I think being able to see prospects have play strength on both ends is something super important. And, I think that's something that I really evaluate in prospects, especially in front court players. I think front court and wings are where I'm really evident on that kind of rhetoric of having strength, being able to be, you know, tangible on both ends of the floor. For example, what I'm seeing in the playoffs with the resurgence of like double big lineups,
Right.
that's something that's, kind of really emerged, out of the blue. And we've been able to see teams, especially like OKC, with Hart and Chet, be really successful in terms of, their overall input and, impact overall into the game on both ends of the floor with their size, their length, rebounding, understanding that, they can kind of bring different kind of variabilities and variance to their offenses in terms of roster building, kind of lineups that they put out, and just versatility in general. And I think that's one of the biggest things I also would say is pretty important when you're looking at prospects, being able to kind of scale down because a lot of these prospects, when you see them relative to their situation in college, you see, sometimes they are the initiator, sometimes these guys are
Right.
offensive engines in their collegiate or international or respective clubs. And I think it's super important to understand that when you get to the league, a lot of these guys are going to have to be scaling back their offense. Are there ways that they can impact the game without the ball in their hands? Can they move off ball? Can they shoot at a high level? Can they attack closeouts? Are they guys that can finish at the rim or just generate their own offense, respective to the amount of touches that are probably going to drop severely once they get to the league if they're not on that top end of the draft. So I think when looking at some of the names in the draft, especially relative to the Atlanta Hawks, I think some of the biggest things I'm looking at in prospects, of course, is the things that I mentioned in terms of size, physicality, length, and some of the names that pop up, respective to what Atlanta is looking for. One of the first names that popped up is Thomas Sorber, and I think this is one of the prospects that I really fell in love
I
with.
love it.
I love him, man. I love
Yeah,
him. I think when I look at a guy like Thomas Sorber, he's somebody that I personally think is probably the most versatile big man in this class. When you think of what he's able to bring in terms of his size, his versatility on both ends of the floor as an interior scorer, overall rim protector, in terms of his ability to like space the floor and kind of be able to just impact the game in terms of passing as a short roller, and also, of course, as a rebounder. So I think there's a lot of things to love with his game. One of the biggest things, I think a really great development in terms of the pre-draft cycle was the NBA testing, and something that really came back was his measurables. Being able to be a guy at 6'9" with those shoes with a 7'6" wingspan, is pretty remarkable. What are the size that he brings, and also kind of the impact that that length can have. And, I think it's, as you mentioned in your tweet here, plus 8.75-inch wingspan differential, which arguably is the most impressive quality of his
right.
relative to the testing, the highest in the class in terms of bigs. And it's just crazy to think the size that he has in terms of a 260-pound frame, the wingspan differential. Like these are things that come into the league right away and are like one of the peak percentiles amongst all big men, as you mentioned here, fifth biggest in the NBA if when drafted. So it just tells you like day one, these are things that he'll be able to just come in right away and just be a physically imposing player. And that's something that was very apparent on tape. I'm going to bring up some tape of his and kind of just go over things that
For sure.
really intrigued me when watching Sorber this season. And one of the sad parts of the season was despite the injury that he had with his foot, which when it comes to big men, you really understand that size and that kind of frame is very taxing on your body. And I think one of the things that uh, when you watch him, you could see that size is something. So let me know if you see the screen.
Yeah, I can see it.
All right, so I mean, when you see a guy like Sorry, I mean, you just see these kind of plays where he's just able to impact the floor.
Mhm.
A guy that, respectively, a guy that's at 260 pounds, being able to move, make plays like that on the interior. One of the things that's been really intriguing with him, is the ability for him to kind of space the floor. And, despite the shot being kind of developing right now, he's at 16% on the perimeter. It's just the ability to want to take that shot. And I think one of the biggest things when it comes to prospects is kind of the initiativeness and their assertiveness to want to space the floor. A lot of the
Mhm.
big men in this class, um, respective to Sorber, not many of them are high level spacers. And I think one of the biggest things when it comes to front court development is, especially with the bigs in the playoffs, seeing those guys being able to space the floor and still be high level rim protectors, rebounders, and just being able to overall improve and show their size on both ends. And, a perfect example of this is a guy like Chet, where, maybe
Yeah.
he doesn't have the same physical stature in terms of weight and frame as a Thomas Sorber, but I think one of the most intriguing things is his ability to be a spacer for OKC. And I think you see the kind of elements that they can be able to run with their offense in terms of 5-out offense. And then it just also allows a new variability in terms of how you're going to have to guard him. Is he going to be able to shoot the ball on the perimeter? Is he going to be able to attack closeout. So I think this adds new elements into the ways that you guard him. And I think that's the things that I look at in prospects. How can you change up your game and allow people to, you know, get a read on you as a player? And I think, when I'm looking at a guy like Thomas over here, where and he's able to take the ball from the elbow and just go downhill and create for himself, as you've seen in the previous clip, being able to space the floor on the perimeter. Granted, the efficiency's not there, but it's the willingness to do that. It just shows
Yeah,
you that he has a great base to work with. And then, it's kind of the other things, being able to be effective on the defense with his length, as you mentioned, with that damn near 9-inch wingspan differential, being able to kind of impact, get a steal right there, impact play, and make a assist to his teammate. Um, as I mentioned here, as I was saying, with the spacing, being able to offer that openness to the court with his teammates, it's something super important. And I think that is something that I really valued on a prospect like Thomas Sorber, where, he was playing on a Georgetown team relative to the situation. It was a poor spacing team. It was very inconsistent play throughout the season in the half court. But I think one of the consistencies was Thomas Sorber's impact, being one of the highest rated BPM freshmen in the nation. So, it was very apparent his impact on both ends. And I think a lot of the things that he does, like the micro niche skills when it comes to screening, kind of being able to available and make himself, and of course being able to finish at a high level at the rim. There's a lot to like with a guy like Thomas Sorber. The size, being able to kind of have a very wide radius to catch passes like this and still finish at a high level. And then, as I mentioned, with that size, being able to just kind of just close offenses out and finish at the rim, and also being able to protect the rim at the high level. So, there's just a lot of things that you can see a prospect with a guy like Thomas Sorber impact the floor right away on both ends. And I think, respective to the Atlanta Hawks context, I mean, when you look at that situation, as you mentioned, with okay, I can't even say his name, Onyeka Okongwu and Clint
yeah,
Capella, I think you see kind of the slow departure of a guy like Capella and being phased out, and want to see the young guys like Okongwu kind of implement himself in that offense, and having a lot of success statistically when it comes to like defensive ratings, offensive ratings. So I think being able to add another high level big man to kind of your front court, and being able to offer you a lot more variability in terms of what he provides. I think sometimes it's important to understand, like, it never hurts to add more depth in a respective position, and especially when a player is going to offer you different, skills relative to the other positions or players on that team. So when you look at a guy like a Kongu versus a Sorber, a lot of people are going to say there's a crossover with the size, the rebounding, the rim protection, but I think the ability for him to space the floor, the ability to be a really great short roll passer, is going to offer a lot of variability. And of course, as you mentioned, with team building, it's going to add a new kind of openness to the way that you guys are going to be able to put lineups out. And, as you guys were able to see with, Jalen Johnson, Zachary Rissache, these are some of my favorite wings and front court forwards in the league for
yeah.
mine. And I'm able to see, like, you guys are able to put out a lot of size and defense and rebounding. And these are things where, I really envision guys like a Rissache, guys like a Jalen Johnson, Dyson Daniels, potentially in this case for Sorber, if we were to get sucked in by Atlanta, you could just see that defense would be just kind of your calling card right away. And it just shows you that a team where, maybe in recent playoff cycles, you guys have been kind of finding yourselves in that plan, not making to the playoffs, little area. So it's trying to find a way to kind of, how do you get over that hump? And I think defense is something that, in these playoffs where, when push comes to shove and the offense isn't flowing, is the defense going to be something that sticks? And I think that's something that we've been able to see with a team like Indiana, a team like OKC, and ultimately these two teams, being able to be in the finals. So I think that would be one of the first names that I would mention. But I want to kind of get your thoughts on Thomas Sorber personally, and maybe where do you see his fits at with Atlanta in your front court?
Yeah, I'm huge on Thomas Sorber. Like right now, I've been redoing my board as I've been like diving into more prospects. He still remain like top six, top five for me. To
Hmm.
give y'all like some more numbers on his impact, because I really do believe he was one of the most impactful interior defenders in the NBA. Sorry, in the NCAA.
Hmm.
When he was on the floor, Georgetown held their opponents to a 48.3 rim percentage, which would be equivalent to the second best rim defensive field goal percentage. And all of D1 held them to a 42.1 2-point percentage and just 91.9 points per 100, which was the best defensive rating, relative to the rest of the D1. With him off the floor, they allowed a 62.4% rim percentage, 58.5 2-point percentage, and their points per 100 allowed went up to 117.3. And of all the bigs in this class, he has the biggest rim field goal percentage on and off. So, yes, he had a subpar context, which helped like inflate that on off, but he was also incredibly impactful in his actual minutes. You
Hmm.
mentioned the wingspan. I know Hawks fans, and I think for myself as well, we've always been obsessed with this concept of a 7-footer. Like we haven't had a 7-footer since the Kembe Mutombo. Anytime
Yeah.
I post about the Hawks, they're like always He's like, we're not taking, we got to take a 7 footer, got to take a 7 footer. Like they love Ryan Kalkbrenner. Hansen
Yeah.
Yang is getting some love. Um, Sorber will have a standing reach similar to those guys,
Mhm.
and he also moves better. I think from what I've seen with the foot speed, being able to switch his hips, being able to change, go at different angles. He's not.
Mhm.
I don't project him as a exclusively drop big. I
Yeah.
don't think he's the most versatile defensive big in the class. Like I think that
Mhm.
obviously go to CMB, but he's more dynamic with his feet than like Amala watches. I think he has
100%.
more space with his frame. I think he has better positioning, and so
Mhm.
he's the guy that like I am no questions asked taking him at 13. I think the foot injury is going to give someone some pause. We had a similar scenario with Onyeka Okongwu, and his athleticism hasn't been. It took him a long time to ramp up. It only just now started getting back to where he looked pre-injury. He
Yeah.
is a bigger guy than Onyeka as well, so I can understand the concern there. And also with his injury, he's not going to be able to do any testing or play in summer league, which is really unfortunate because that's good. That's big evaluation time, and like for a Hawks team that does need someone who can contribute with the way they want to play, it
Mhm.
means that if they select him, they probably need to sign a veteran because I don't believe they're going to re-sign Clint Capella. So with all that being said, I think my belief in also I didn't even mention the passing. Like I think his passing is legitimately one of the best in the class relative to his position.
Yeah.
So one thing and one thing that's also stood out in these playoffs, you mentioned Chet's ability to be versatile and like introduce different types of offense.
Mhm.
A lot of NBA teams are playing a lot out of delay, and all delay is your five
Yeah.
man at the top of the key as a dribble handoff hub or setting screens. And
Mhm.
Sorber didn't again like he had Micah Peavy, but he didn't have like a ton of dynamic guards. But
Mhm.
that is the type of stuff I can see him slotting in almost immediately because he has a big body, but he also is able to make those bounce passes on the backdoor cuts. He's able to
Mhm.
angle his body off of handoffs and rescreen or be in that short roll like you mentioned. And like outside of that particular playoff lesson, like some other things that have helped guide my decision making for the Hawks as I build out this list, which we'll get into in a minute. Like strength creation, like you mentioned, the ability to that's on defense and offense, but like the ability to play through contact. We saw Mikal
Yeah.
Bridges completely down screens, get fried in
Mhm.
transition, be a little bit hesitant around the rim. He again, guy with a plus wingspan, a notable defender, but he doesn't have like that sort of edge or physicality. Um, I think you really need guys who can dribble, pass, and shoot. You can't just be a pure 3-and-D guy anymore.
Mhm.
Off-ball defense has really stood out to me as well, just because when you get to the playoffs, as good as even like a Dyson Daniels is, we've seen it
Yeah.
with times with Jalen Brunson. Like these guys are so good. Some points they're just going to get to the spots and going to rise up over you. So the ability to be disruptive in the passing lanes and also on their dribbles is really important. And then yes, like those are the playoff lessons that stuck out to me. I think that Thomas Sorber released he fits in with the strength creation, he fits in with the weak side rim protection, he fits in
Mhm.
amazingly with the front court playmaking and interior passing.
Yeah.
Um, is there any other like playoff takeaways? Because especially from your perspective as like a Minnesota fan, because the other thing that I
Yeah.
hear a lot from Hawks fans is like, okay, we need to get a backup point guard, and
Mhm.
that is something that I've also seen from Timberwolves fans. So I'm curious, similar to that, where like, okay, have you seen in the playoffs? Have you seen that same need for the backup point guard outside of Minnesota? And is there anyone for yourself for Minnesota or for Atlanta that you would consider as like a guard prospect? Because I think both teams probably are going to go big. At least in my opinion, the Hawks will probably go winger big. I think that Minnesota will probably go big at 17. Maybe they do something else at
Yeah.
31. Are there any guards that could either fall to you at 17, follow the Hawks at 13, that still align with like all these lessons from the playoffs?
Yeah. I mean, I think respective to your point that you mentioned with Minnesota and kind of needing a backup guard, I think when you look at kind of their philosophy of, we've seen last year they pretty much traded a little bit of their future and traded up in order to get a guy like Rob Dillingham at number 8. And, it was something that, you get a very high level shot creating guard, but even with that offensive talent, he really found it hard to get onto the floor, with Chris
Yeah.
Finch. And I think that's something that he's really emphasized. He needs guys that can play defense and guys that can kind of impact the floor. And I think there was a article that came out from Owen Phillips that was talking about from the F5 talking about,
The
your
weak link.
team is at yeah, your team
Yep.
is as
Yep.
good as the weakest link on your team. And I think in some of the minutes, even when he was getting very scarce minutes in some of the blowouts versus OKC, you could see instantly right away that even down 30, down 20 at times, OKC's impetus was, to just attack him. And there's possessions where he was just getting hunted. And this was in very scarce, 5 to 6 minutes left in the game. And this just kind of puts to you in perspective kind of the story that's been told with Minnesota and their kind of backcourt issues respective to guys like Mike Conley, Rob Dillingham, and why when I'm looking into the draft, even though we're probably going to go 17 with a big, I think with a back end of the pick in terms of like 31st,
Right.
a guard is important. And I think when I look at a guy like, Rob Dillingham, he has all the great shot creation in the world. But, when you look at the respective side with a guy like Terrence Shannon Jr., where, he's this very high level slasher, the shooting could be inconsistent, but the big thing about him is the size that he brings and the defense. And it was something where when you were watching these games with Minnesota, right away, he was having his imprint on the game on both ends. And I think that's something that you see with Chris Finch. It's pretty much the emphasis. Like he wants guys that can bring size, defense, and high level scoring, and I think when you look at Minnesota, a lot of the issues with their rosters, like they have the team in terms of a guy like Anthony Edwards, kind of the defensive pieces in terms of guys like Jaden McDaniels. One of the issues is can they find that second co-star to play alongside,
Right.
a guy like Anthony Edwards in that backcourt? And I think some of the issues with that is kind of the variability of the offenses that you bring because, with Julius Randle, I think the initial talks with Randle prior to trading for him versus kind of the perception of him afterwards have definitely changed. When moving off Cat first, I think all Minnesota fans, all hell was breaking loose in terms of you're arguably giving up the best shooting big in the NBA, and then in return you got a guy like Julius Randle and Dante DiVincenzo. What you sacrifice in shooting, you probably get back in play finishing and maybe some connective play in terms of Dante DiVincenzo, some shooting, of course. And I think the perception of this team has definitely changed, and you could see kind of the leap that certain guys took on this team in terms of like Jaden McDaniels offensively. Most importantly, Anthony Edwards. When you miss out a shooting from a guy like Cat, it helps that Anthony Edwards has arguably one of the best shooting seasons of all time.
Yep.
Leading the league in 3-point makes. So I think when I look at guys in the draft, respective to where we're selecting in terms of 17 and 31st, I think the focus, which I think this is something that you can agree with in Atlanta, is as you kind of get down the back end of the draft, it gets really scarce in terms of finding really strong backcourt play that can kind of just come in right away. And I think one of the examples that unfortunately this guy went back to college was a guy like LeBaron Philon. This was
Right.
somebody that I was really high on throughout
Same.
the cycle, despite the scoring, maybe taking a dip throughout the season, playing alongside a guy like Mark Sears, being able to have, how can he impact the game in terms of other aspects, the connective skills, the strong POA, being able to be a guy that can kind of do secondary scoring creation. He was a guy that, at 6'4", being able to be, again, on the lankier side, but I think it was the perimeter defense skills that really kind of wowed me saying, could this guy play alongside a guy like Anthony Edwards, where, if available at 17, I was pretty much all for that. But at 17, I think a name that I had mentioned in some spaces was a guy like Ryan Kalkbrenner. I think this would be somebody that I'm really super high on for a pick at 17. But I think the 31st, I think I'm still trying to see what names still in, what's still out, what kind of guys I projected on that end. But I think as you were mentioning with Atlanta, it's really tough when you find this kind of market for backup guards. And, we were able to see, a guy, for example, like Nikhil Alexander Walker with Minnesota, who he was pretty inconsistent throughout the playoffs. But, I think one thing is certain is the size, the shooting, and the defense that he brings. And they're all high level. And I think it's just a matter of getting consistency out of him. So I think maybe from your perspective, where do you feel like the deficiencies are in terms of your backcourt situation? Because I know with Minnesota, with the cap that they can have as a team, it's really just can they outshoot teams, can they outdefend teams, and they were able to do that in the first two rounds against LA, against Golden State. When size really wasn't something that was overbearing on them, but a team like OKC who can pretty much put out a 6'6" guard and three multi-versatile, rangy wings that can shoot and defend at a high level. They can whip out double big lineups with Chet and Ihart at any time, and they just have the depth that can just pretty much stifle you and just swarm you at all times. Where do you feel like you guys need in terms of roster building? Because I know again with the moving off of guys, for example, as you were mentioning with a trade with DeJounte Murray, this opened up a lot of pretty much financial stability and openness in terms of how you guys can create in terms of your offseason. But where do you feel like the development is with Trey, and what kind of running partner you would want in terms of backcourt play? Because I think outside of him, I know you mentioned, not mentioned you, but Kobe Bufkin was somebody in the backcourt that he's somebody that kind of needs to catch up to speed because of some of the injuries that he's had and kind of just catching up to the physicality of the game. Terrence Mann. There's just a lot of kind of question marks with your backcourt. So what do you think is the direction that you guys want to go in terms of what you want in a perimeter creator, as a secondary option guy, somebody that can run units, someone that can maybe potentially play alongside a Trae Young in certain lineups. What do you kind of feel at that?
Yeah, I think Kobe Bufkin has been front of mind for me. So I think I actually had someone ask me this a couple of days ago, and he asked me, "Okay, how are you feeling about Kobe going to the next season?" Because basically, my overall point was the Hawks are pretty poised to take advantage of like um, this new like push towards turnover creation, right? So throughout the
Hmm.
playoffs, and I'm pulling up the graphic right now, as you can see, teams that won the turnover battle have won 72% of the games. And that's a sharp increase from last season. It was about 61%. Again, some of that is OKC dominating, right? The OKC has won the turnover battle better and more consistently than any team in NBA history. But it's been a consistent trend, right? You generate more possessions. Turnovers are the only way to guarantee your opponent doesn't score. And it creates the highest quality offense for your team, right? And that's where
Hmm.
Dyson Daniels fits in exceptionally well. Great turnover creator. Of course, he has great
Hmm.
hands. He's in the passing lanes. He's on the ball. And so my overall point was, okay, I think the Hawks are pretty well poised to do that because, we have Dyson Daniels, who's among the league leaders in forcing opponent turnovers. You can see here he's in the 97th percentile. These guys didn't play much. Larry Nance and Cody Zeller didn't play at all. But you have guys like Mohamed Gay, Onyeka Okongwu, Karis LeVert is pretty handsy. Ariza Shea was a positive in terms of deflections as well. Now the guy who's missing is Kobe Bufkin.
Hmm.
And Kobe Bufkin is someone who I was really, really, really high on
Yeah.
in the draft. I was ecstatic when we took him because for me, it was either Kason, like I wanted Kason. He was my number one. I wanted the Hawks to get him so bad because I believed in him to be like he played bigger than his frame his entire career at Kentucky, but also
Hmm.
just like he was legitimately special as a defender and he was a legit shooting prospect. Of course, OKC takes him. Um, Dallas
Yeah.
took Derek Lively before we had a chance to get him as well. And I didn't think Kobe Bufkin was a bad consolation prize at all. He was shooting 70% on the rim with 25% of his rim attempts unassisted or assisted. So like he was generating his own offense. He was a positive defender. He had all the steal and field indicators. I loved his
Hmm.
pace. I loved the size, even though he was a little bit slight. He had the frame to grow into being that
Yeah.
second side ball handler. The rookie season, the injuries were tough, but when he played, you could see the suffocating defense he was able to play. Like he gave Jalen Green fits. I posted a video of that another season where I just had 5 minutes of Kobe Bufkin like isolation defensive highlights from within the arena because you could see
Hmm.
the hand checking, the games he's playing defensively. Like it reminded me of when Gary Payton was talking about how he would pump fake on defense, right? So he would act like he's going with his right, and he'd actually did with his left, or he'd act like he would like shift his stance up and then actually jump back right in front of the defender. And I could tell he was a
Hmm.
very cerebral defender, and I was really really excited to see what he looked like, especially because he didn't get to play summer league his first year. Or he
Yeah.
did
He
play
was
summer league
injured.
his first. He did play summer league his first year. He was really bad, which happens. Second year coming in, we had of course
Hmm.
Reza Shea, and Bufkin was going to be the only real point guard on the roster ends up hurting his shoulder again, and now it fell to Nikola Jurisic, who again, great player, but he was super raw as a point guard. So like it was a cascading effect where like Reza Shea had some
Yeah.
bad games, Jurisic was overextended, whatever it may be.
Hmm.
It really comes down to this though, like he's played less than 25% of his first two seasons, and that's kind of brutal, right? Like I mean, the guys who don't like some of these guys like just weren't good basketball players, right? Like some of these names, like they just weren't good at ball. But like, or
Yeah.
you have the guys who had catastrophic injuries in their first couple of years, like Fultz, Greg Oden, Joel Embiid. Buffkin's only played 16% of his games in that first two seasons. Now he got some time in the G League, which is definitely going to help. But I mean, when you look at the average season played, like it's a severe drop off. Like most first round picks since the merger play at least 8 seasons on average. When you fall to less than 50% of your first two seasons, you fall to around 4, 5, and then once you play less than 25%, it's less than 4. And I think it's to the Hawks' advantage to continue to give him burn and a chance to break into the rotation because he's still a guy
Hmm.
on a rookie contract. You
Yeah.
can't really. I mean, if you look at the free agent market, there's not really guys that can come in and run an offense anyways. Like
Hmm.
I think Chris Paul, great mentor, but I don't know if I want him
Hmm.
playing NBA minutes at this level with the type of defense that we would have behind him. Like it's fine if it's Wembanyama, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think there was before we got Dyson Daniels, Kobe was going to be the guy that eventually was going to have to force his way into the rotation for us to have that defensive level guy, right? Now
Hmm.
that you have Dyson, it's like, okay, Dyson is, and in the games that Trey didn't play, I thought Dyson really shined as a secondary ball handler and as a creator. that game
Mhm.
against Boston in particular. But his handle still isn't exactly tight. His aggressiveness can wax and wane. He's he's never really been like, and this happens sometimes with international prospects. He's never been asked or tasked to create everything like out of structure. And that's
Mhm.
I'm gonna remember that I said that because I'm gonna have a question for you about that later. But Kobe in comparison has ran an offense and like he's created for himself consistently. And so like yes, it was on a different level, but I'm comfortable with Dyson as a secondary ball handler. I don't know how comfortable I am with him initiating the offense without Trey on the floor for extended amounts of time. And that's where like
Mhm.
Kobe Bufkin's different handle, his pull-up three-point shooting, the feel, the mid-range game, the floater is still more developed than where Dyson is. So the Hawks can't really afford to be super patient with him, but there's no reason to like cut him. But I also don't think he's the type of guy that like you don't trade. Like there was a
Mhm.
lot of like chatter that we didn't want to trade him for Pascal Siakam. I don't think that's necessarily true. I don't think Siakam is going to sign here. But yeah, it's not. I'm not at the point where like I think there's only like one guy who I might be able to convince myself to take at 13, who's a guard, and that'd have to be with all the bigs would have to go, all the wings would have to go, and if Casper's is on the board,
Ooh.
maybe. But I'm also not a huge fan of him. But I just think like you
Mhm.
have to take the Hawks do have to take a creator bet, and they have to take like someone. I feel like he's going to be someone who could at least attack closeout, put the ball on the floor. I think he could be
Yeah.
a bench creator, like a bigger TJ McConnell, like a constant paint touch, a
Mhm.
good feel, stuff like that. But that's what our guard situations look like. I think that you guys have. We've also a lot of Hawks fans have had our eyes on the Kill Alexander Walker. I know y'all are frustrated with him, but he's not
Yeah.
someone that I want initiating the offense either, right? So like if that's the
Same
guy we
thing.
go get a
Yeah.
free agent for, if we
Mhm.
spend free agency money on him, which is cool, like I wouldn't be mad at it. We just can't expect him to run the offense. It'd have to be like, and also Terrence, man, you mentioned him. Please no, like no, he can't do it either. So it's like,
I hear it on my TL a lot when I see Atlanta fans talk about just him, and as you
yeah,
mentioned with like Trey needs help. It's evident, and yeah, it's tough. And I mean,
I
when you
think
look at like the free, oh, go
the
ahead.
hope is like Jalen Johnson grows into like being more of a handler, but I
Hmm.
also think like ball handling is yes, it's a skill you can develop, but it's also somewhat tied to your frame. If you have a very upright frame, if you're not comfortable getting lower to the ground, if you don't have the flexibility in the bend, your handle will always be a little bit uptight or upright. And if your handle's upright, then of course it's harder to protect it, and you're going to be prone to guys digging in the gaps. And I think that he's a very upright player.
Hmm.
That's why he's so good in transition, but it's also why he needs to understand how to like almost condense himself in the half court and
Yeah,
and get and get pliable and get bendable and so I think he's probably even further as a handler than like Dyson is. But I don't think they can go into next season. Karis also, I should mention Karis LeVert. Karis LeVert was a big help when we traded for him because he was able to at least create for himself, but he's also not someone that like I want to run the offense. So yeah, you have guys who can approximate it. Ideally, Kobe. It's harder for me, even as someone who's really high on him, to expect anything from him, considering how little he's played. G League is
yeah,
one thing, practice is one thing. You need NBA reps, especially as an NBA guard.
yeah.
So I don't know. Like I know you was talking about the free agency class, so I definitely want to hear those thoughts before like I think about what else it could be.
I mean, I was just gonna mention like the free agency point guard class for like 2025 is really nothing special. I mean, with guys like Fred VanVleet, Josh Giddey, Dennis Schroeder, Chris Paul, like these are the names that are going to be headlining your
Yeah.
2025 free agency, respective to the point guard. So it's a very weak class relative to like 2026, where it's going to be a lot of the big hitters. And I think it's one of those things where do you kind of burn a year to see guys develop in terms of their on ball stuff, and as you mentioned, like with the handling, like in terms of like all the stuff in offenses, handling is one of the more easier things, respective to other skills to develop. But it's like, are you waiting for guys like a Reese Shea or like a Jalen Johnson to develop those kind of skills when they really don't have that kind of center of gravity, especially when it comes to what you need as a handler. When I was watching Daniel, like we were watching Dyson Daniels, back when he was with New Orleans, and that was a place where he was tasked to create offense and initiate at times, and you could see why at times New Orleans felt like they were out on him. He was really struggling, and that's something that he's really not been, asked to do. And that was something where when he was at the G League Ignite, he was playing off ball. He had some on ball reps, but again, you can't just expect somebody to just kind of jump right into a situation and just kind of develop skills as they go. And I think that's one of the issues with a lot of wings and just kind of off ball guards is like, do you go through that burning pain of watching guys develop and improve their turnover efficiency? And it's tough because it's like, when I do look at a guy like Kobe Bufkin, funny enough, I had mentioned Kobe right after I was mentioning LeBaron Fallon because that was one of a direct comp that I was looking at him where it was a 6'4", skinnier guard, but a guy that can be able to bring a lot of POA skills, scoring creation, and obviously secondary handling. These are things where I was like, a guy like this would be perfect on a lot of teams. And this is somebody that I had coined as like a 16 game player. Hopefully if he improves the frame and, be able to address some of the questions that I have with him offensively. But, I think it's, as you right mentioned, like these are kind of guys where you kind of just have to expedite their process and hope that they can kind of catch speed quick and, improve the frame, handle the physicality in the league. So, I think us potentially losing a guy like Nikhil Alexander-Walker and having to kind of trust a guy like Rob Dillingham and kind of having to wane off Mike Conley's minutes, it's going to be tough because we know what's going to happen. A lot of these guys are going to get hunted. A lot of these guys are going to kind of having those growing pains of struggling physically in the league. But, granted, they're very high field offensive talents, strong shot creators in this case for Rob Dillingham, scoring creation when it comes to a guy like Kobe Bufkin. But it's kind of, what's going to happen in terms of their development and kind of having to expedite that. And sometimes it's going to be good and it might cash out, which, you had examples of that with the past. But sometimes, often than not, it's going to be a really struggling period. And I don't think with the timeline, as you mentioned, with Atlanta, same with Minnesota, you really don't have that kind of time to just waste a year developing guys, especially when you have players that are in win now archetypes. And I think that's when you look at your roster with Trae Young, it doesn't help that you go another year without contending seriously with the kind of skill set that he brings. So I think it's super important. Depth is extremely important when you watch these playoffs. You see teams,
Yeah.
even though they're running, 6, 7, not even 6, that's too rich, 8, 9 man rotations, oftentimes there's, a really jumbo sized creator. There's somebody that can continuously generate offenses in, non SGA minutes, Halliburton minutes. And, where we see that, for example, with a guy like J Dub on OKC or for a guy like Nemhart on Indiana. There's been times when we watch, for example, like the Denver Nuggets, these non-Jokic minutes. What can they provide in terms of creation skill and all these offensive half-court creation? And it's tough. And I think that's one of the things that where when you look at these teams that are really diced in terms of their depth of front or backcourt play, you see that like they're asking too much of their stars to kind of come in and have to do everything. And ultimately, that's where teams that have that depth, but it's meaningful depth is super important. That's why
Yeah.
we ultimately are seeing these teams in the playoffs ultimately in the finals as well. So yeah, I think we're literally on the same boat in terms of, needing that backup guard and a guy that can kind of come in and take those on ball reps. But it's when you see the back end of the draft, I think with you, as you were mentioning, with 13, if Hesperas potentially lands there, it doesn't hurt to get up him, but I don't think that's somebody that you're kind of coming into on draft night saying, I'm going to be wowed by,
Right.
selecting him. And, even though for example, like I had posted him today, posted some work of his, PNR scoring and playmaking and just overall tape of him in pick and roll situations. And he's a very strong PNR creator, but I think for a guy at 6'5", he really struggles at creating on his own in the half court without
Yeah.
screens. And it's not necessarily like a burden in terms of saying you can't not have screens when it comes to creating in the half court, but it just when you see guys in the league that are jumbo size creators, like a K, like an SGA, like a Halliburton, you see these guys that are able to kind of create for themselves, but also most importantly create for their team. And guys especially that can get that downhill, be able to shoot at a high level. I really kind of have struggles in being able to see if Kasparas can do that at a high level. As you mentioned, is he somebody that can just be, a really great combo guard bet or a strong creator bet at the next level, or is it just going to be somebody that's kind of going to max out? It's like going to be a bigger TJ McConnell. So, it's tough with these kind of guards. There's always like things that you can like nitpick and say, what do I not like about them? Somebody that I very rarely high rate in this class, for example, is like a Nolan Trier. He's somebody that, at 6'4", brings exceptional speed, great not rim protection, but rim finishing, and just
Mhm.
overall frequency. But, the shooting, the overall defense, these are things I have questions with. Similar to a guy like Jeremiah Fears, where, he's one of the stronger rim finishing guards, overall scoring talent, but, is the three-point consistency going to be there? Is the defense going to be there? So I think a lot of times it's just a matter of there's issues with a lot of the guards in this class, which for people that are saying this is a very deep draft, I think it's a very top end draft, but there's guys in the mid stage that you can kind of fill your team out, if they are in the right situation and they can hit and ultimately develop, learn certain skills. But I think we're literally on the same boat in terms of, what you want to select at 13 in terms of front court. And for us at Minnesota at 17, it's just really in terms of, for you at 22, what can you find in that back end of the draft that's going to be meaningful in terms of, front court, back court play that, and it's tough. I think at 22, for example, a guy like, Walter Clayton Jr., I think that's somebody that might go a lot higher than expected, given the scenario of a lot of these guys kind of falling out of the draft. What we would have loved to see, for example, like a Todd Pettiford. I think that was a guy that potentially could have been a first round bet.
Yeah.
If everything made sense. It's just
The
tough.
NIL stuff, man, like it's like you mentioned it's top heavy. I think if Bennett Sturts is in this class, if Toppin's in this class, if Yax was in this class, if Phylon,
Oh
Tahad,
yeah.
like we're talking about. I don't think it's 2026 level, but I mean we're talking about a massive step up from 24.
Oh,
And
100%.
yeah, I think like the back half, I was so excited because of the plethora of options. Like
Hmm.
immediately after the tournament, like I was like 22, even 22 to 25. Like I didn't really care much, but I want to ask you too because
Hmm.
I want to get your thoughts on just like these are like these are the five guys plus Cedric Coward and Hansen Yang. Oh, so you
Hmm.
can't see the last one. These are basically like my current like okay, these are the guys I would consider at 13.
Okay.
Of these guys plus Coward and Yang, who do you think I'm a little bit too high on? And if you don't have anyone I'm too high on, or if you just have someone, is there anyone I'm missing that you think the Hawks should consider at 13?
Um, I think there's a bet where maybe a Rasheer Fleming could get at
Okay,
least consideration
let
for
me
13,
ask you
but
about Rasheer. Let me ask you about Rasheer because to
mhm,
me, okay, I've been trying to like stratify my board more, right? So I've got
yeah,
like, okay, there's Flag, who's going to be, I think he's primary initiator, all defensive team level. I think he's all NBA
yeah,
player. Then the
mhm,
next tier is more so like, okay, these are guys that I think could be sporadic all stars, but they'll approximate all NBA impact at some point, at like what maybe like 1 year or so. Then I've got the
yeah.
guys who are like, okay, these are the guys I feel like could be top tier role players, could maybe get one or two all stars. I think Fleming is like he is okay. If John Collins was a little bit twitchier and more consistent as a catch and shoot 3-point shooter, I think he'd be Rasheer Fleming. What I'm concerned about with Fleming is like he's a very static guy and he's a very siloed guy. Like he's really good at the things he does. He's gonna hit those
Mhm,
catch and shoot threes. He could
yeah,
put the ball on the floor to drive the closeout, and he's pretty good using his length. But I mean, I'm concerned about the off the dribble stuff. I'm concerned that he's never hit an off the dribble three. I'm
yeah.
concerned that he is very he's very static, like or very like he's inflexible. You know what I mean? So like that's why like at 13, I'm like, I think I need a more fleshed out guy.
Surefire
I think
guy.
I need a guy. Yeah, you know
Yeah.
what I'm saying? But am I wrong for thinking that way? Or do you have a different opinion on Fleming?
No, you're completely correct on that, man. Or like when I look at Rasheer Fleming, like what you're getting with him. I think there's a lot of prospects where
Yeah.
they're like, I know what I'm getting with this guy in terms of super high floor, maybe a low ceiling, in terms of what they can develop. And when I look at Rasheer, he's like play finisher, high level defender, potential, all defend like all NBA defensive guy. With the size, 6'9",
Yeah.
7'5" wingspan, like his measurables are crazy, but it's a matter of is he going to be able to create for himself in the half court? He's somebody that, really strong, he really is strong as a transition guy, somebody that can attack closeouts, and that's really it. And as you mentioned, like, some of the play styles here, when you see guys like this, like his archetype is insane. But I think when you see how he plays, I think that example of a John Collins that is like a lot more twitchier, someone that can be a lot more consistent in, spot up shooting, I think that's a very fair comparison to make because when you look at him, he was I think the only player in the NCAA that I think 60 dunks and 43 pointers. So like what you're getting with him. Like
Oh
you're gonna
wow.
get a spot up shooter that can shoot. The shooting I would say is a caveat because this is the first year that he really shot above a sub
Yep.
30%. So is that something that's gonna stick? That's one of the things that you get with him where he's a very versatile guy. You know what you're getting with him defensively. But it's really the offense, as you mentioned. And I think the inflexible part, that goes back to the point that you're mentioning with like a Jalen Johnson or like a Reese Shea, where is he somebody that's going to be able to get a low center of gravity, a lot of bend, and it seems like he's very stiff. That's
Yep.
definitely a fair sentiment that I could say is like he's a very stiff player when he plays, given the size, the length, but he makes it work. But I think he makes a lot more sense in the 22 range versus the
Yep.
13. But for some people, they've been, overrating him to the point where he could potentially get considered in at 13. A guy that you mentioned on your list that I personally don't think is worth of consideration at 13, just because of the concerns offensively and how he projects at the next level, is a Carter Bryant. And I think one of the things when looking at a guy like Carter Bryant, he's a top 5, top 4 defensive player in his class. With that goes without saying. He is a special defender, 6'8", super rangy. I think he's like one of the only players in his class, maybe barring a Cooper Flag, maybe a CMB and Penda, that can guard 1 through 5 comfortably. And I think when I look at a Carter Bryant, such a strong defender. But the issue is his offense. It's so low usage that can I trust the attacking, the closeouts, the high level shooting? Like, when I was looking at some of his half court creation in terms of rim frequency, it was in like the 20s to like low teen numbers, but he finished at a 72% of the rim. So, he clearly can get at the rim and finish it at a high
It's
level.
like all
It's just
cuts and dunker spots.
exactly, and exactly like, a lot of his percentage of his rim finishing was based off of like the spot up in terms of cutting and just like miscellaneous ways that he can score transition, things like that. So
So
I'm
how
worried.
similar do you think he is to Ryan Dunn in terms of because Ryan Dunn, I felt like again, this is a I have a type. I'm gonna be honest, Mohamed. I do.
I could
Ryan
tell
Dunn
already.
Ryan Dunn was my son, man, in 2024. Like I was like, yo, I love
Yeah.
this guy. I love how active he is. I love how disruptive he is. And I don't think he had a bad rookie season. I think he was somewhat
Mhm.
impactful, but you could
Yeah.
see how he could even with all his defensive impact and his gifts, it wasn't as loud as it was in college. That's number one. But number
Mhm.
two, the offensive stuff could be a bit detrimental. I think I'm
100%.
I think from I'm somewhat encouraged from what I saw from him pre-NCAA, like the handling, some of like the turnaround shots. He even tried some of that stuff at Illinois, not Illinois, at Arizona. I honestly feel like he wasn't. I don't think he would have declared this year if Krivis doesn't go down. I think
Mhm.
when he got thrust into that role because Vasar slid over to the 5 when they lost their 5 man, and he
Mhm.
performed really well. Like one of the high speed PMs for a freshman. I remember you posting that. He had great on off numbers. Like if you look at all the other guys on that team, like he was one of the guys driving the impact. There's a reason he closed so many games. There's a reason he was consequential in the tournament. And so I think that there's a world where he comes in and he's immediately impactful in the same vein that Reza Shea was in terms of like just being a competent guy defensively who can somewhat space the
Yeah.
floor. But
Mhm.
there's also like as much as I think he's as much of a green flag as a prospect in his personality and his approach to the game. Like everything I've ever heard about him, the man meditates
Yeah.
before games. He has the OG Anunoby wristband or armband. Like he is like I as much as I can believe in a prospect's mental without ever speaking to them, without ever getting an interview, I think
Yeah.
I do. But I think the offensive concerns are valid, especially for a team like we just mentioned. Like we need some creation bets. Like I was in one of my Hawks group chats. My guy Chris, who's on the Hard Knock Hawks podcast, he said
Yeah.
it's an indictment on Reza Shea that he never, or just from the way the Hawks view him, that he never really got creation reps as a number one pick.
Mhm.
And as much is that them saying that he's not ready, or them saying that they don't think he can get there. And if he can't
Mhm.
get there, you don't really have. Yes, I think both Dyson and Jalen have sky high ceilings. I think Jalen has, but as we mentioned, there are physical limitations to becoming a go to scorer.
Mhm.
There are mentality limitations. Like even Jalen Johnson, as much of a physical force as he is, I find a lot of games where I'm like, bro, you're 6'10. You're 6'10, you're 230 pounds. They put him in the rim. And I think that um as much as I'm saying that, also at 13, like it's like, can you really get a guy who can create with creation upside? Outside
Mhm.
of CMB dropping, I don't really think you can. And so I think that's why Carter's on my board. So what range
Yeah.
do you have him in then? Like as much as I think the offensive concerns are valid, and do you just see him as at at what point do you just think he'll never be like offensively viable, or do you think it's more so like his first couple years, like he really will need time to figure it out?
Yeah, I think that's kind of where I'm at with a Carter Bryant, where he can shoot, at a great level off ball. He can finish at the rim at a great level off ball, but he was just pretty much like imploded into that offense second half of the season. And initially coming into the year, I didn't see him as a one and done guy. I think I
Yep.
seen the profile and physical tools, and I'm like, this is a guy that could be a one and done guy, but it's really just a matter of what he does on the court. And it was something where, first half of the season, he kind of struggled to get on the court and consistently stay. And as you mentioned, like the injuries to Henry Vasar, Krivas, through opportunity, he got on the court and, through his impact, he stayed. And rightfully so. He was somebody that was one of the more impactful wing defenders. He was somebody that was pretty much, their POA, their interior defender at times. He was doing pretty much everything for Arizona defensively. And I remember Tommy Lloyd was mentioning that, like, if there was a way that we could find a way to keep him, like they would send the bag for him. And he was somebody that, he's
Mm.
always had aspirations, as you mentioned, like the mental aspect. Like he's a guy that is a killer. I was looking back at some of his tape, when he was in high school at Arizona, or not at Arizona, in California, and he was such a killer. Like there was games that he was dropping 40 points, 20
Yep.
rebounds, 10 block. He is a killer. And I think, as you mentioned with the mentality, like the mental stuff, it's just as much of a game as it is the physical. And I think when you think of guys like a Carter Bryant, like he plays the part of an NBA guy just as much as anybody else in this class does. Now, does the production, make himself a point where I feel confident in that? Again, it's just a usage. I think a guy that for where people are projecting him, like again, I think I have him in that 15 to 20 range, which it's still within, lottery. I think he's a lottery talent. It's just in terms of opportunity and usage and production, it doesn't match that. And when I look at a guy like him, he has the skill set to become a very great 3 and D guy. And I think when you look at 3 and D, I don't want to box guys in because being a 3 and D guy in today's league is not just hitting shots and defending. Like you see a lot of the guys, especially the top
Yep.
tier guys, be able to create off the dribble, be able to kind of have connective skills, passing. And I think these are things that I kind of worry with a guy like Carter that he has skills to kind of again hit shots as a corner guy, being able to attack closeouts. I mean, his frame and play strength, like it's definitely translatable on the offensive end, 100%. It's just a matter of can you do the little things that can get him on the court and stay there? The passing, the handling. Can you get downhill enough and create confidently? As you see in some of these clips, like he's a guy that can hit shots really well and defend really well. And I think the way that the league is transitioning, especially in the playoffs, as you mentioned, like a lot of these secondary, tertiary creators are these wings that can do a lot more than just defend and shoot at a high level. One of the names that you had mentioned earlier in the call was a guy like Mikal Bridges. Despite him getting fried, he's somebody that is always going to get consistent burn. Maybe not necessarily to a Tibbs situation for how he plays with guys, but like
Mm.
for what he does, like he's able to put the ball on the ground and score, get downhill, hit shots, find ways to connect the game in terms when when Jalen Brunson doesn't have the ball when he's on the court, he can make impact. There was a time when we saw OG Anunoby in the second series of the playoffs where he was putting his impetus on the game against the Celtics, even early on in the series against Indiana, where he is finding ways to score the ball when all hell breaks loose or when the offense isn't shaking. And I think
Yeah.
when I project a guy like a Carter Bryant, you see that like he is such a havoc wrecker on the defensive end that I have no doubt in my mind that this guy will not be an impactful NBA player. I think he is somebody that could have an all NBA upside defensively at one point in his career, maybe multiple all NBA bets. It's just a matter of if he's able to kind of consistently do that. And I think with wings, I'm starting to notice it more that like I need these guys to be able to handle the ball and create for me to feel a lot more creative, or not necessarily creative, but for me to be more confident that these guys will stick in the league. When I look at a guy, for example, like Noah Singh, who you mentioned on your list as well, with for a consideration of number 13, he's somebody that kind of falls in the same boat in terms of a really high level defender, a guy that can really play finish very strongly, but is he able to kind of put the ball on the ground consistently? Can he handle? When I watch a lot of his tape, it's in transition and it's kind of playing in stride and not necessarily
Yeah.
doing it on a standstill creation. And, again, with somebody that's the second youngest player in the class, you have a lot of confidence that this guy will grow. He's in an upward trajectory in terms of development. But I think in terms of as of right now, I'm worried in terms of, how is he going to be able to handle as will a lot of this list. But I think one of the guys that I feel a lot more safer on is a Nick Clifford. I think Nick Clifford is that kind of guy that is the wing that can create and pretty much do everything for you. And I think he's been somebody
Mhm.
that was tasked to do that at Colorado State, where, previous to last season, he made an exceptional jump this year as a PNR creator, overall scorer. I think his 3-point shooting took the highest leap this season. Anything in terms of his overall creator bet, like I felt very confident in him, with the measurables 6'6", 6'8", wingspan, like, they're not necessarily the most favorable, but in terms of what he does on the court, this guy is like the definition of winning impact and scalability. And he's somebody that I felt very confident in being an impactful player from last season. I think when looking at his pre-draft stuff in 2024, he was somebody that was a more connector guy, and necessarily I wasn't confident in becoming a creator. I looked at somebody like, I was pretty confident with Nick Clifford was like a Josh Hart, a guy that can pretty much
Yeah.
rebound at a high level, a guy that can pretty much connect play, but hit shots when need to. But really, I don't see the upside of him as a creator. And then he pretty much took that feedback, came back to Colorado State, and pretty much was integral in their success this season in terms of winning the Mountain West, giving them a tournament bid, ultimately making it to the Sweet 16, losing at the end to a buzzer beater by Derek Queen. But he was somebody that like is the definition of I take feedback, add it to my game, and really grow. And I think some of the concerns with Nick Clifford goes to some of the age concerns, him being 23 when he hits the league. But in terms of just a player that fits what you need in terms of a wing that can create, shoot, defend at a high level, and score, I mean, Nick Clifford he fits the bill for that, and I think that's somebody that maybe at 13, considering what is it that you need? Do you need somebody that can kind of come in right now? Is it somebody that you can kind of wait and watch them grow and develop? I think for Atlanta's sake, like guys like a CMB, like a Nick Clifford, probably are on the top end of and a Sorber as well. I
Mm.
think those three guys have pretty much separated themselves from the rest of the other picks in consideration for 13 because I think those guys all have playoff skill that can translate right now in terms of
Mm.
size, defense, multi-creation scoring, with CMB being able to be a strong finisher at the rim and kind of creating, despite the shot concerns, which is very valid. He's somebody that is a very great string creator and I think gets to the
Yeah.
rim at will. And I think the size and mismatch hunting that he can do will be really effective in the league. Similar with a guy like Nick Clifford, a guy that, despite not having the craziest of wingspan differentials, he gets it done on both ends. And I think that's somebody that I really feel confident in being an impact player on both ends, and similar to a guy like Thomas Sorber. And I think, as I mentioned, like those three names, Thomas Sorber, Nick Clifford, and who did I
Colin
mention?
Boyles.
Those three have separated
Yeah.
themselves pretty much from the rest of the bodies in terms of like a Noah Singh, where I mean, I have Noah Singh number 6 on my board, so I'm very confident in him, being a really great player in the league. But in terms of what Atlanta needs, I think there's just too much crossover with him and the other 6'10", 6'9" wings and forwards that you guys have on your roster. I think
Mm.
finding a guy that can kind of fit in because I think with Neek, he's somebody that can fit at the two. He's somebody that could, in certain lineups, fit at the three.
Yeah.
And there's times where he's been playing pseudo point guard for Colorado State. So that is another guy that could offer you some secondary creation in the backcourt with size that can complement really well next to a Dyson Daniels, a Trey Young. So I think those three names would be names that I would pretty much feel really confident in. I don't hate the Carter Bryant at 13. I think he's somebody that's been scaling up boards really quickly. And I think that's the same sentiment that I feel with a guy like Cedric Howard, where you see how defense is super important, and you see these wings that have the physical profile, and I think you have the thought in your head of what they could become as a creator. And oftentimes, guys, the thought of a prospect will go a lot higher than the reality of them, and that's where you
Yep.
have been seeing guys, especially wings. I think wings are the perfect example of like thought versus reality, and
Yep.
it's very heavily based on like the physical profile, what they do on defense. Can they shoot at a high level? Can they get to the rim at a high level? But it's not necessarily on like high usage. Those kind of
Hmm.
guys are like in scenarios you're never going to ask them to be a number one or a number two for the most part, but can they have the ability to attack a closeout? Can they shoot? Can they offer you some type of spot up shooting or spot up creation? I think that's why I feel very confident in guys like a Coward being effective in the league in terms of just that, in terms of a high level creation that some of these people, for example, I think Kevin O'Connor had him fifth on his board, which, that might be too rich, but I think that is taking into account the creation skill becoming something in the league where if you really see that, then I 100% am behind Carter Bryant at 13. If you see that creation skill there, then by all means, I would take him there. It's just a matter of that the handling is behind. I think he's somebody that probably would benefit a lot more from another year. But I mean, I think this is the highest that his stock is ever going to be. And I think when you consider what he can do defensively, like that's a thing that will translate into league right now. When you could see the shooting, despite it not being on high usage, that's something that could stick right now. The rim
Yeah.
finishing, despite it not being on high frequency, that can be in the league right now. And sometimes guys, we've seen it plenty of times in college where a guy comes into the league and they're better in the NBA than they are in college relative, to improved spacing and, just the size that they have and, context with their team in college versus in the league. There's just guys that might perform better in the league. And I think wings in this class fit that bill. I think a guy like a Carter Bryant, if he was selected by Atlanta, makes sense to where he would probably fit better in the league because he has spacers around him, guys that can create for themselves, but he can offer you something in terms of the shooting and the rim finishing, and obviously the defense. But I think I'd feel a lot more confident with those three names that I mentioned earlier, with kind of the top end consideration for 13. And maybe some of these guys that we mentioned are still available at 22. I think Richard
Yeah.
Fleming that we had said, that's a guy that could still be there at 22. Um, I'm trying to think of other names. The Hansen Yang. I think Hansen Yang, that was another name that I think I've been a lot more intrigued with as I've been kind of evaluating guys, especially front court players. He's
Yeah.
somebody that has such a unique skill set. And when you look at a guy like Hansen Yang, like he clearly has the size, but it's really like the on-ball stuff that he does that really intrigues me, and what that fit looks at the next level, like the playmaking stuff. At the combine scrimmages, like he was opening up his offense more in terms of the shooting. I think that was something that really was enticing. Being able to see a guy that has really good shot mechanic, being able to hit some
Yeah.
shots on the perimeter. I was like, Hansen Yang potentially could be a first round guy in my eyes. And I think now, considering with guys taking back into college with NIL and kind of that back end stage from like 20 to 30 really opening up for first round guys, I mean, there's a world where if you're drafting in that range, you just reach on the guy that you feel like best fits your team and their needs versus kind of taking an experimental bet. I think we're going to see a lot of guys in that back end of like 20 to 40 where, they're either specialists, guys that can just come in right away and just give you something tangible. Again, high floor, mid floor, but low ceiling guys that can just be impactful right away. And I think Hansen Yang is somebody that when you see his skill set, he was extremely productive
Yeah.
in the Chinese league. And I think people, when evaluating a guy like Hansen Yang, really don't give respect to the leagues and the talent they have. But a kid that's being that productive, I think he put up 17 and 10 and was still effective
1-7 blocks.
defensively.
Yeah.
He is extremely productive. And I think people don't give credit to production versus potential. And I think it's always the potential side over the production side. And oftentimes that's where you kind of get misses with prospects versus guys that, once they produce at the collegiate level, the international level, pre NCAA, that they're going to stick. And I think, Hansen Yang is, at least in my eyes, somebody that makes so much sense of like a rotational big, somebody that's going to offer you something different than probably like 90% of your front courts in the league in terms of the creation skill, kind of the handling hub. And I think that's something that we've really seen with a lot of guys in this class, like a Danny Wolf, a Derek Queen, like these kind of
Yeah.
bigs that
We're
offer
talking like
you.
especially with the delay action, not to cut you off, but I wanted
Yeah.
like we just talking the delay action, right?
Yeah.
I've watched 4 hours of Yang tape like over the last couple because like I was like, I just gotta see I gotta see him in a context like in the CBA. The
Yeah.
CBA is really bad defensively, like laughably bad.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
he is going up against former NBA quality bigs, like guys like Marquise Chris, Taco Falls over there.
Yeah.
Like the average center is taller in the CBA than they are in the NBA, which kind of
Hmm.
shocked. That being said, like the rotational schemes, like when guards have to pick up on him or tag him, I mean, it's 2 points. His vertical athleticism. There, in my notes, I have like an embarrassing amount of times that like he either missed a dunk or he got blocked by someone he has no business getting blocked by. I
Hmm.
thought he showed up to the combine in great shape. And a direct comparison to another guy you mentioned, like Derek Queen. Derek Queen was not in great shape, compared to
Hmm.
Hansen. Like Hansen Yang came to play himself into the first round, and he
Yeah.
did so. I think that it's tough, especially for like, I mean, it's hard for me to even watch those games. Like, it's actually a hard product to watch. I'm gonna be honest, it is. But like, it's hard to even account for that level of competition. Like, yes, he is playing as he's not even 19 yet. He'll be 19 when he's drafted, but like he's
Hmm.
playing as a teenager in a grown man's league. The average age is like 27 or 28. So like the differential for grown man strength, his production, he led the league in blocks. He was one of just 5 players that averaged 10, 15, 10, and I think like a block and a steal.
Yeah.
So like the production's there, the fuel is there. I think that, and I'll have to continue watching stuff. At this point, I feel like he's the best playmaker in the draft. And I say that
Hmm.
because there's a much higher barrier to entry as a playmaker as a guard. Like we mentioned,
Yep.
if Caspers can't shoot off the dribble and if he can't create without a screen, he can't be a great playmaker. If Fears
Hmm.
isn't going to be able to have that pull up three, if he isn't able to add that mid range game or that floater game, it's going to be hard for him to be a primary creator, whatever it may be. Like
Igor
there's all these
Demon.
questions about the guards. If you
This is
talk about
why.
Yang, there is he is already so adept. I talked about the Sorber being a delayed big and like dribbling handoff comfortability.
Yeah.
That's like second nature for Hansen Yang. I've watched him.
Yeah.
He'll hand off and immediately open up, and when you do that, it creates an angle for your guard, and you can slip the screen, you can roll, you can pop. It's so many options that like he offers just by being comfortable with the ball in his hands. The
Mhm.
angles that he throws passes, the things he tries, the skip passes, the post gravity, it's going to
Mhm.
be a lot easier for him to be a distributor than like any other guard. That's why like I feel like yes, there are guys who can make better passes. Yes, Jaeger can make a better pass. Jaeger is not gonna like I'm worried about him even being an NBA player because of his aggression, because of his like we talking about guys who can't create without screens or guys who
Yeah.
struggle under pressure. Then like Jaeger, like that's that same concern for him. And I think that's why I am so high on Yang. Because again, I feel like this team, this Hawks team, needs a creator bet. And throughout, like I forgot to mention this earlier, the Hawks front court when they were starting Clint Capella and John Collins was the worst front court playmaking team of all time, including DeAndre Hunter. Like they averaged the fewest assists by a starting lineup, like in a very long time. I see you've got some Yang film pulled up, so I'll go ahead and put it on the stage. But yeah, like the this pass, I was on the
Oh my.
PT table and I almost like yelled, bro. Like this, I feel like this angle doesn't even do it justice, but he wraps
Yeah.
that bounce pass behind the defender's back and leads the cut. Mind you, he doesn't even know these guys. There's also a language barrier. Like that's
100%. Yeah.
like he's never played with these guys, and yet he's still this intuitive as a passer. Like he throws it behind Grant Nelson's back and leads. Is that a Tego Elway?
Yeah. Bro,
Yeah, leads the
this is
dribble to the
comfortably
basket.
the best pass. This was the best pass.
Yeah.
And I mean, like even some of the stuff like when he's able to kind of just like I was just watching this clip, like he is somebody that is very aware of his like again, being able to space the floor, as you're mentioning, being very adept as a passer. Like there is so much I love with a guy like Hansen Yang. I mean, I'm somebody where I think his unique offensive skill set, I think he could honestly be an offensive hub in the league at one point in his career. And I think that goes without saying the skill that he has at that size, which, when you look at other guys in this league, like a Derek Queen, like a Danny Wolf, I think these guys are going to be, it's very context based. Like, I think Danny Wolf, the reason why I'm very like indifferent about him relative to how people are going to view him in the league. Is he going to be able to get those creator reps or handling hub opportunities that he did at in Michigan, where he could run 4 or 5 screens, being able to do a lot of delayed handoffs, being able to kind of just create in the half court, where Michigan they didn't really have traditional guards. There was a lot of like clashing with him and Trey Donaldson.
Uh-huh.
I think a guy like Hansen, like this is something where I genuinely feel like him being like such a high skill passer, instantly on day one is going to be something that a team can utilize in rotation as like a second big. Um, I think one of the comps that I mentioned to somebody about Hansen Yang, which it might be too rich, but in grand scheme of what he can do in terms of his full skill set, I had said like a Marcus Gasol. When you see Marcus Gasol, he and I think this is revisionist history. Like when you look at a guy like Marcus Gasol, he was somebody that would absolutely kill in a current today's setting for the playoffs. Like a guy that can
Bro.
defend at a high level, space the floor. But I think it's the handling skill that really opens up everything for his offense and being able to be a guy that is super cerebral as a passer. And I think that's one thing that I've been opening up more to as big men is the comfortability on the ball. And are they able to kind of map the court out and kind of have spatial awareness in terms of their teammates? As you mentioned with the Hanson Yang, that language barrier, I know that was somebody that Gavoni was reporting that, this is a guy that really struggling to have conversation with teammates, being able to kind of open up in terms of court communication, but he can still make plays like that. That pass was comfortably the best pass that I saw that entire weekend. And I was just shocked, like the ability in terms of how he can get balls and bending them behind defenders. This is where I think in an NBA context that he would really strive. And I think people are really not opening themselves up to Hansen Yang as a prospect, considering the skill level of their league. But again, I'm never gonna not deny production regardless of where you're at. And I think that's one of the
Yeah.
biggest things I see. Like a guy that's 7'1", 250 pounds, like he has the size, he has the reach, he has the physical stature to compete in this league. But it's really, some of the questions with like the foot speed, the quickness, I think that's very understood with guys relative to his size. But the skill, I think this is where he would come in as, one of the more skillful bigs in the entire league. And we've seen a guy like Nikola Jokic, which I think the comparison is very rich to big men that can pass and kind of create as a hub. But I mean, we've seen a guy that teams really don't have answers for, guys like this where you can allow different kind of roster construction and building with your teams when you have a guy that can feel comfortable in the ball. which also goes back to a point with a guy like Thomas Sorber, where he may not necessarily have the same hub skill set as a Hansen Yang, but at 13, that's definitely somebody to consider because of the short roll passing, because of the comfortability on the ball. As you were mentioning, like there's times where he would catch a ball in the short roll, but still be able to dish it out, still be able to create. I think that's where I've learned to appreciate playmaking and just overall feel on bigs. And I think I had made a tweet about, quote this tweet with, one of your least favorite archetypes, or, what are your least or
Yeah.
most hated things to see in certain draft prospects. And one of the most common things that I mentioned was big men that have no feel or passing skill. And it's just like, when you have a big man that isn't able to kind of connect play for the rest of your team and be able to show up on the perimeter, being able to kind of do those delayed handoffs, as we mentioned, being able to kind of map the court out and offer himself as another guy that feels comfortable on the ball. I mean, you see the gaps in play between guys like a Nikola Jokic that really just change the game in terms of how you can view big men prospects. I think when you look at a guy like Hanson Yang, I feel very confident that like the shot blocking, the size, and the ability to just space the floor up, maybe not necessarily at the highest level, but he's somebody that is, again, back to the point that I was mentioning. Do you have assertiveness in terms of do you want to space the floor? And that's something that he has. And he's just super productive. And I think that's something that I'll always give credit to. And most importantly, the rebounding. I think, like I mentioned, no rebounds, no rings when it comes to the playoffs. And he's somebody that, as you mentioned in your graphic, 23.5% defensive rebounding percentage. I mean, he's somebody that makes it an impetus to get on the glass, but not with that, being able to take that and then drive and transition to be able to create with that. Things like that make him, a jaw-dropping prospect. And I think, such a high offensive talent. I'm super high on him. I think at 22, he's somebody that definitely should be in play 100%. So I really like him. A
Yeah,
lot
I
of
think
people don't like him because of the talent in the Chinese league, but
yeah.
I'm telling you, production is production, man.
And what you just said about like the grab and go, I have like 4 or 5 clips that I'll probably post tomorrow of him
Mhm.
either getting a block or getting a rebound and pushing the ball up the floor and
Yep.
seeing a guy like if I was to give Clint Capella the ball, if Trae Young was to give Clint Capella the ball in transition, it's an automatic turnover. He'll probably kill somebody in the crowd with how hard he'll kick it off his foot. But you can
Mhm.
legitimately give it to Yang and let him facilitate in transition, which is ridiculous. And you
Yeah.
mentioned Marc Gasol, like looking at his again, accounting for the league and all that. 2021 Marc Gasol was the oldest version, the least mobile version, but that was when he was most polished as a passer, right? Like
Yeah.
he had fully adapted to the space. He was taking more threes, and that was his closest comparison to the NBA. And he has a legit frame with again Andrew Bogut, who was that facilitating type big man. He's someone I'm super excited about, and someone that I like. I would definitely want the Hawks to take a look at. The Hawks are one of the 5 or 6 teams that sent a scout specifically to China to scout him, and so I know that he's likely on their radar. Um,
Hmm.
I'd imagine that at this point, again with all the guys who left, I don't think he'll get past Brooklyn's like last couple picks. Like I think Brooklyn will probably take him in that late 25-ish range. So he
Yeah.
may be there at 22. I want to show you the other guys I have in play at 22. Now there are a bunch of guys who ended up going back to school, including, Yaxel, Alex Condon, who I loved. That was
Oh,
my
he was
guy.
so good. He's the definition of a guy that, like, when you talk about handling bigs that can kind of
Yeah.
just do everything, like, it's the little things. I think another thing too is like when you think of this like high skill offensive guy that has like this high end upside, can they do the little things good? And I think bigs that have those archetypes really don't do the little things like screening, being able to just re-screen and just being able to have the passing skill, being able to rebound. I think Alex Condon was like a surefire bet to be that kind of guy where, I mean, in his tournament, he really struggled in terms of like what he was really good at. But, from a season long
I mean, but
perspective,
everyone struggles against Houston too. That's the thing.
yeah,
So
exactly. So, I mean, I'm always going to give them leeway. But I mean, what Alex Condon put on tape in terms of the screening, the passing, the playmaking, rebounding skill, being able to feel really comfortable on the ball. It was the Alabama game where he had 27 points, I think like 10 plus rebounds, but he had like three threes. And that was something where, like, if he could ever develop the offensive game to where he could create, not maybe for himself, but just be a guy that could space the floor, that's a serious NBA prospect. So, despite him going back, he's 100% somebody that's going to be on my board very highly next season that, I'm going to
yeah.
be looking at very closely and along with a lot of names on this list. But yeah, there's some names on here that are some really heavy hitters. So, I mean, to think that this would be in consideration for 22, it's so crazy that like this is the talent pool that you're in, and then potentially it drops off after 22. So it's crazy to think like you could get a steal at both 13 and 22 and kind of just run away with the draft.
Yeah, I think, and I definitely want to, pull on your expertise for some of the international prospects. I know you got some tape together for the audience. I think it's it's always tougher for guys to watch or for fans to watch the international guys just because the time difference and where they actually air. So,
Yeah.
but I think for 22 and me, like I think again, what I've mentioned, I think the Hawks go bigger wing. If they go wing at 13, then I think Moreno would be someone I would heavily consider. Super
Mhm.
skilled Stanford big, was super productive. What I really loved about his game in particular is that there's a level of like being able to be a pick and pop threat. Obviously, is a huge, huge, huge value added today's NBA. Like every team that made it to the conference finals had a pick and pop big. Now, I'm not saying like it's the ends all be all. Like if you get a big pick and pop big, then like you'll be able to make the conference finals. But
Mhm.
it's a different wrinkle, right? Like we mentioned the short roll passing, Sorber. We mentioned the sort of dribble handoff hub with Yang. Reynaud he made the second most threes by a 7-footer ever in D1. The only other guy who made more was Lauri Markkanen, who's legitimately like a really talented shooter at 7 foot. He also
Mhm.
he was second in double doubles behind Yaxel, which is crazy.
Yeah.
And he also was he wasn't the ACC Player of the Year. It was runner up the flag, I believe. But he
Mhm.
had the most double doubles in like high major D1. We're talking about a guy who averaged nearly 20 and 10. He's a legit 7 foot, although he doesn't have the plus wingspan of some of the guys we talked about. It's just 1 inch taller or
Yeah.
longer. He's like a really, really skilled big though, and he did so much of that Stanford team, which is what like again, like those teams are just mind you, it's not easy to play. The ACC this year wasn't like the best, but it also is like for a team like Stanford, like there's a lot of comp for him that I don't like. He didn't just play bad teams. Like he didn't just feast on bad teams, and he
Mm-mm.
grew a lot as a defender this year. He was
Yeah.
pretty much a non-factor at the rim in previous years. And some of the interviews he's done, he said that he was never really taught how to block shots. So he was late to basketball. He was a swimmer growing up, and
Yeah.
when he came to Stanford, they didn't even let him on the basketball court for the first couple months. They made him run track and get in shape. And so he's a guy that, again, guys will always say the right things in interviews. And again, I don't have my own personal way to actually connect with him, but he's a guy that like I've seen the work, I've seen the production, I see his
Yeah.
attitude, I see the way he communicates on the floor. He was the best player on the floor in his combine scrimmages. Like
Oh
it was
yeah.
disrespectful for him to be on the floor, at least in my opinion. And he got pulled for day two because he was that
Hmm.
much better. And
Hmm.
so he might not think of like Jakob Pertl as a massive guy, but they have pretty much the
Yeah.
same frame. And I think his play style comparison was pretty favorable to Kristaps Porzingis in Washington that first year that he got there. And that's
Yeah.
because a lot of the offense flew through Maxime. I think when he scales down as like a guy who he'll probably look more like a Miles Turner, where he'll be that short roll pick and pop guy. He could set screens. He can somewhat finish through contact. And there's a lot of room for guys who could shoot the ball this effectively at 7 feet. So I'm curious on your thoughts on Maxime. I know a lot of the questions I've gotten on him are defensively, and that's fair. I think if you want
Yeah.
to go
Yeah.
defensive at 22 and you're talking about NCAA bigs, it'll probably be Kalkbrenner, and I know that's something that you're high on.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be a direct comparison between those two guys, but I'm just curious, like if it came down to like if Maxime's on the board, would you consider him for the Hawks? And I know you probably go Cockburn, but just does Maxime make sense in your mind for the Hawks?
100%. Yeah. Oh, 100%. I mean, when you think about what he does, like I have some tape that I was gonna show of
Mm,
him, but he he was somebody that prior to the season starting, I was like, he's been playing for years at Stanford, and he was somebody that was really intriguing last season. But I think this season he really put it all together at Stanford, and I was somebody that was super big on this kind of archetype of guys that can really stretch the floor, attack closeouts, be able to be that guy that can do so much on the court in terms of the passing, the defense, rebounding at a high level. And it was really just the rim protection stuff, as you mentioned. Like this is somebody that was kind of a late bloomer into basketball and just overall his instinct. But it's very evident on the court that he's a very high feel and very smart and cerebral player. And I think when you're watching him this past season at Stanford, like granted the competition in the ACC was tough considering this is their first year in integration into ACC basketball, but he
mhm,
was somebody
mhm.
that, was literally in contention for ACC Player of the Year behind Flag. Had not been the success that they had at Duke, but he was somebody that was extremely productive. He was a walking 20 and 10 every single night. And I think it goes without saying that this is one of the best, not even just big men, but flat out players in this class. I love Reno. I think people really, when they look at him, I think their shtick with him is that they just see he has no defense. And I think that's, very unfair to say. Like, he's a guy that high level shooter, a guy that can get to the rim, plays a lot bigger than what his wingspan differential entails. But I think he's somebody that is very smart on the court, that he makes do with what he has in terms of his physical limitations, athletic limitations. He is very cerebral, especially on the defensive end, where, a big that may not necessarily generate a lot of stocks. He's somebody that has a lot of impact and does definitely deters a lot of shots at his rim, whether it may not end in a block. That goes here without saying, but he's somebody that's very impactful on the floor. And I really love a guy like Reno. He's somebody that, I mean, when you look at him, he's one. When I look in the league, I think guys like, for example, like we were mentioning, like, a Brook Lopez, where, maybe necessarily the wingspan differential, but it's kind of the impact that he has in terms of a guy that's a footer that can shoot at a high level, rebound. You hope that the defense catches up with that offensive skill. But I mean, a guy that can just get downhill at will. I mean, you love the size that he brings. A guy, again, can screen the ball well. This is, again, an example playing him against Duke. Against a guy like Kaman Malik, who, is considered a lottery talent, very strong big man, somebody that is really good defending in space, a guy that can just shoot over those. I mean, you love to see things like that. Another example of him being able to pump fake shots, being able to still get downhill, finish at the rim, being able to have that little floater game, which I think that's something that I've really learned with big men. Like, for example, like iHeart, that push floater is something that opens up offenses so much with big men. And I think if you can have that kind of touch around the rim or in the paint area to kind of have float shots, but still be able to finish at the rim effectively, I think that opens up your offense more to where, a guy like Reno, maybe if he's not going to have the same kind of usage at Stanford relative to, where he gets drafted in the league, in this example, like Atlanta, he's somebody that can make the most out of his minutes. And as you see right here, being able to defend well in space, contend shots at the rim, and ultimately get blocks. I think this is a guy that is really going to open up your floor as a spacer, as you see right here. He's just a guy which I think when you look at the big men in this class and their shooting, a lot of their mechanics are very slow. And I think with a guy like
Yep.
Reno, he's somebody that his release, especially with this high like axis point or apex point with his shooting, his shots really do not get contested a lot, which is surprising. Like, his shot is not like the fastest, but it's a shot that does not get contested at all. And I think that's something that you really value in guys that stretch the floor. Like, can they shoot over, of course, guys that are relative to, their defensive skill, but a guy that really is just inept to being contested. So, I mean, I love the high arc, a guy that just is very physical down low, and his touch is so good. I think that's something that's very underrated. Like, a guy that, especially with stretches, like, kind of the gimmick with stretches is that their touch is poor, which is why they're on the perimeter a lot. I think that
Mhm.
goes without saying. Like, Reno is a very great touch big, and despite the frequency not being there as much as you would like to see with a big man, him being the hub for Stanford, there's that's context. That's giving leeway to the situation that he was in. But I mean, when you watch shots like these, like, you definitely get enticed into considering where he would fit on your roster. I mean, you love the size and just being able to be physical down low. I love him at 22. I think that was somebody that, we were mentioning in different group chats together where, I mean, Reynaud he is a great player. And I mean, as you mentioned, like, he, in the first day of the scrimmages, like, he looked like he didn't need to be there for what so
Yeah.
reason. And he ultimately got pulled after the first day, and rightfully so. I mean, he was somebody that has pretty much solidified himself into top 20, top 25 consideration. There's a lot to like with a guy like him. And, I'm super big on a guy like Reynaud. I think, again, the defensive concerns are very valid, but when you look at the offensive skill set that he brings, and I think what he's able to do as a mover in space, I think you're confident that, even if he's not necessarily generating stocks on the defensive end, that he'll still be very impactful because of how much ground he can cover, in terms of, as like a drop big, being able to just kind of play in space. I think he would be like the perfect complement in like these double big lineups that you see with, a guy that can really stretch the floor at a high level, kind of being able to play on the perimeter, both on the offense and defense. He's really good. I really like him. I think he's somebody that is valued a lot higher than where their draft position is. I think, like, in terms of skill sets and what they will do and impact in the league, I think he's a top 15 player. But I think relative to age and overall development and feel, he's a guy that could land at 22. And I think when you consider what you get with him at 22, especially with what's considered in the later half of the draft, you run away with that. And I think that's a steal. So I think he's one of the best big men in this class. And I mean, that's full stop. So he's definitely somebody that I really like. I think in the respect to him versus a Kalkbrenner, I think the defense is what makes Kalkbrenner a lot more enticing, and he's super efficient at the rim. But it's really just like, as you were mentioning earlier, like when you look at Kalkbrenner, you know what you're getting. You're getting a guy that can finish uber efficiently at the rim, and he can defend at a high level. Not
Yep.
a good
Bufkin that.
mover. Exactly. And I think with guys like Luke Fournette, these are guys that, probably for the majority of their career are going to be very rotational guys that, serve as second big men that, will just come in 15 minutes max, 15, 20 minutes that can rebound at a high level. You hope that they can maybe potentially space the floor at one point in their career, but, just a guy that can really defend well and rebound well. And I think Kalkbrenner, that was something that I was mentioning this past week. Like, he's a guy that is a day one impact guy because of the skills that he has, but it's like you really don't build off of that because he's on the fifth year senior side. I'm 23 years old on draft day. I mean, when you look at a guy like Reno, who's a lot younger than him and has a lot more offensive skill set and widening into his game, I think that's where you feel like a guy like Reno, if the defense does come about, you have a very mighty fine stretch player in the league. So I think that's one of those things where, the size and kind of the strength creation on the defense, the rim protection can improve. And I think that's one what goes without saying. Like, if the offense is there, build on what you have with the defense. Obviously the length isn't crazy, but he's somebody that moves really well in space. And I think I credit a lot with bigs that can move well in space with their ability to still contain guys, when it comes to switches on pick and rolls, being able to kind of be a help side defender. I think he has that skill set to where if he's on a team like Atlanta, where he already has a lot of multi-positional, versatile forwards and wings alongside him, he can play off guys like that and still be very effective despite having other covers for him defensively. So I really like Reno. He's a very mighty player. So I mean, I think we've mentioned that a lot. Like, he's a player that, if I was Atlanta and I was at 22, I would seriously consider him if you do go the direction of wing at 13. But I think for where you guys probably go, I think if the draft night goes as normal as possible, which there's no world that happens considering what's been transpiring with the draft lottery and things
Right.
like that, potentially a Sorber at 13, and then maybe go wing or maybe like that multi-positional front court, backcourt player at 22. But I mean, maybe from your perspective, what do you think? I mean, considering the list that you have, what would be a dream night on the first round with 13 and 22 in terms of this guy's available at 13 and this guy's available at 22? This is a hit, and I'm extremely content. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. And before I forget about it, I do want to mention, like, I said Luke Cornett for Kalkbrenner, but Luke Cornett was like the most impactful bench player in the NBA this season. And yes, he's playing for Boston, but that is the
Mhm.
value of like play finishing and rim protection. But to answer your question, there was a time where I felt very, very confident on like, okay, I would be so elated with this outcome, right? And
Yeah.
at that time, it was okay. Sorber, who I still feel like if we get Sorber at 13, I'm ecstatic. But I
Yeah.
think 22 has opened up a lot for me, and some of that is tuning more into our international tape. Like Noah
Mhm.
Penda has started to intrigue me more.
Mhm.
Even Nolan Traore, like you mentioned him too. Like he's someone who I think may slip. I think um, it's tough because there's
Yeah.
guys that I like. I think it's honestly easier to say like what would make me upset, and
Let
because
me hear that then.
yeah, there are a lot of guys that like everyone you see on this list, any
Mhm.
combination I'm cool with. You know what I mean? Like if we leave with Neat Clifford at 13 and Maxime Reynaud at 22, I'm happy. We take Thomas Sorber at 13. We take Rasheer at 22. Look, I'm happy. I just don't think you
Ooh.
could probably double up positions. Like I don't think you should do like two wings, two bigs. But if you
Yeah.
get some combination of the wings and the bigs that I have on the board, as well as Cedric Coward and Hansen Yang, I'm cool. I would be infuriated to see Jaeger Demon in a Hawks jersey. I would be I would be beside myself if we took
Yeah.
Derek Queen at 13, not because I think he's going to be bad. It's just I am
Context.
severely pessimistic about his defense. And
Mhm.
we, as much as we have the multi-positional guys to give someone like Maxime, who's a true 7-footer and has at least the positional instincts to be a
Mhm.
big body, Derek Queen doesn't play like a big body, and he plays like a big body on offense, but he doesn't do that on defense. And he
Mhm.
also, I am very concerned about his ability to be positionally sound. And even if he is as transcendent offensively as people are projecting him to be, Nas Reed had a really rough playoffs. And again, when we
I was
talk about
just gonna mention that.
the upright handle, and that is Nas Reed is, in my opinion, I don't know if he's more skilled, more so like more skilled in terms of the modern NBA. Like we're talking about a true stretch five, who in
Yeah.
theory could drive closeouts, who in theory could create his own shot. And
Hmm.
again, he ran into an all-time great defense, and Golden State is also a very good defense. So I'm not knocking him. I'm just more so saying he is the realized version, the more perimeter optimized version of Derek Queen, and he was not able to be impactful outside of the Lakers series, which was a garbage defense. So that's why, like Jaeger, we mentioned his lack of aggression. Derek Queen, I think it's a situation thing. I think he needs to go somewhere where he can play like I think Washington makes perfect sense. Like next to Sar,
Literally.
I would love that. I don't
Hmm.
think we have the versatility defensively to take a guy who's that compromised. And I also have questions about his offense. But yeah, I mean, Cedric Coward at 13, Cedric Coward at 22. Like there's a lot of guys with wide ranges. As long
Hmm.
as we get one of Coward, Clifford, Carter Bryant, Rasheer Fleming, Adu Thiero, who we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah.
Um, I think I've cooled a little bit on the Sengway throughout our conversation just because I
Hmm.
did kind of feel like there was some overlap. But I think the Hawks also just need like you can never have you said this too. You can never have too many like 6'10 athletes. You know what I mean? Like
Hmm.
you are going to get to some point you're going to be like Toronto, but if you take 3 6'10 guys who all are athletes and are transition threats, maybe one flames out, but I mean, like it's I wouldn't be upset at it
Yeah.
even if it's not the best use of assets because again there is some overlap. And if you leave
Hmm.
with one of Sorber, Colin Murray Boyles, Maxime Reynaud, and then my next tier would probably be Cal Brenner, and then my tier after that would probably be Joan Behringer, who again we haven't had a chance to talk about yet either.
Yeah.
That would like I'd be cool with it, but I just think they probably need to stay away from guards. I don't want Jace Richardson. I see too many guys mocking him to the Hawks. That doesn't make any sense. Um,
Yeah.
Ben Serif is a big guard who I haven't had a chance to watch a ton of him yet either. So like I still need to look into the international prospects. Oh, and Penda is someone who I'd also be okay with. Will Riley, I think if you'd have to go with a really defensively sound guy at 13 to be okay with taking Will Riley because
Yeah.
he his stock indicators are like abysmal. Like it's like unprecedented and
Yeah.
he's very weak positionally in terms of like his actual size and strength. But yeah, I mean like they'd have to try hard to make me upset. And I think because of that,
Yeah.
like I'm sure that, I mean, as long as it's not Jaeger, man, like I think I could talk myself into anyone else, but
That's like the
it's
one
kind of rough.
guy where a lot of people, which I think I always laugh when I look at consensus draft media when they prop a guy up like an Igor Demon, where I mean, when you see like it was coming out, I think it was draft lottery day when
Mhm.
we were seeing some of the measurements come out of guys in, like the first couple of days of the combine, and it came out that like he was 6'10. And I was just mentioning to somebody like there's no benefit of him being 6'10. Honest to God, a guy that is one of the better passers in this class, but he can't leverage that passing in terms of scoring gravity and being able to, put the ball on the ground and create for himself at the rim, being a, very good shooter. I think that was something that you had mentioned earlier with, what does this guy look like when they're stripped of this skill, And I think a guy like him, he's not going to have nearly the same amount of on-ball reps that he did in college when he was in the league. I think something like him, he's a guy that, in college you're a guard. In the NBA, I think he makes sense as a connective wing, but with those connective skills, when he's not able to kind of create for others, can he create for himself? And I think that's the issue that I have with a guy like Yegor is like, what does the offense look like? What does the defense look like? I understand he has the length, he has a very tantalizing passing skill, but does the ball go in the hoop? He's not like this exceptionally stock generating defender. He's not like this, outlier level shooter, rim finisher. So it's like, what's the intrigue with him
Yeah.
that, other people are saying he's like a lock at lottery? I do not know. And and there's always guys like that every year that are like, they're just locked in lottery that you question, like, what is their NBA translation? And more times than not, your gut feeling is correct. And a lot of people say like a Josh Giddey. I think with Josh Giddey pre-draft, the famous graph that came out of like his draft card that had like all negatives and pretty much like he was
Yeah.
just horrible at basketball. Even then, I was still a lot more confident with him as a rim finisher and shooter, despite the kind of the woes that come with him as a shooting, especially like last season with OKC, where he was pretty much played off the floor as a shooter. If that's somebody that's being comped to you and you're lesser of them in terms of your offensive upside outside of the passing skill, I just worry, like, again, and this goes back to the point that you're mentioning with Nas Reed. I apologize for the tangents, but a lot of these prospects, their archetypes do not make any sense in a playoff setting. Derek Queen in a playoff setting will not make any sense. I think when you look at a guy like him, which I'm going to go back to each of the prospects that you're mentioning,
Right.
like especially ones that you don't want in Atlanta. For example, like a Derek Queen, you see the kind of feel and skill that he has, and I think coming into the combine testing, I felt good about him. I think leaving the testing, I felt, there's a lot left to be desired in terms of the physicals. And, he was doing an interview with Kevin O'Connor and he was mentioning like what stage does he feel at on like a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of his body right now? And, in 6 months, 8 months in the league. And he's like, well, I'm at a 6 or a 7 where, I'm definitely not there yet physically in terms of his foot speed, in terms of his body, in terms of where it needs to be to, contend in a current moment at the NBA. I don't think like a guy's like him for the way that he's projected, like where he has to play alongside a rim protector in order for him to succeed in the league. I think that's a lot of the context with a lot of the guys that don't make sense for you in Atlanta, where for majority of where they fit in the league, they need to work alongside a specific system, a specific player or archetype. And Derek Queen is one of those guys where, everybody gets so enamored with the skill that he has in the passer, just the feel and people say that he is essentially like a guard in a big man's body, and that's really true. And I think when you look at guys like him, last season, Alex Sarr, where they're very averse to doing very big man things,
Yep.
rebounding, screen setting, and I think that's some of the issues that I have, specifically to like an Atlanta Hawks context, where how does this guy fit alongside certain guys in terms of your forwards that I mentioned? Does he fit as a sole five in the league? I think these are concerns that you are very valid to have, and I think we should all be considering and not avoiding when it comes to kind of discourse on Derek Queen, and same as well with Igor Demon. Um, I think I'm trying to think of another name that I would not like. Hey, go to my board. I think some things that I don't like for example, like a Ace Newell. I think that was a name that
Oh
initially
yeah,
maybe like
I should have mentioned him. Like I would be livid as well. And it's
savage.
not that I think he's bad. It's that it's I and this is a consistent theme. I am worried
Mhm,
about guys who have played in very favorable contexts in terms of like covering their weaknesses. And I think
yeah.
he played a lot of minutes next to Sorrell. And Derek Queen played
Mhm.
all his minutes next to Julian Reese. I mean, look at his numbers without Julian Reese. Like that defense was untenable. And it's like
Yeah.
Newell is again like he's a John Collins regen than me without the face up
Mhm,
game and without the consistent without even a semblance of a consistent 3-point shot. And
mhm.
we talk about upright guys. He's the most upright guy in the class. Like he's a definition of a tweener. A lot of Hawks fans, and I'm so happy you brought this up because I would have forgot about him. That's how much I've put him out my mind. Like I have even come to I've convinced myself they won't even look at him because if I think if like
You'd
if
be
we even come
surprised.
in, I'm sure they will, and it's frustrating.
Yeah.
And it's like
It's like Athens, Georgia, he's right there,
right,
like,
and
he's a
I can
can't miss
understand
prospect.
it.
I'm like, "What?"
I can understand being intrigued, right? When I
Mhm.
watched, I think I put this in the chat. I watched the 2023 World Cup. He popped off the screen. I don't remember if I was actually, but like he was he was functioning as the five in that setting. But again, like you're talking about when they're 17, guys aren't nearly as physically imposing. And he kind of has remained that same size. Like he is not, he doesn't have anything about him that says he's a five man. His base is thin, his shoulders are kind of thin. I'm
Yeah.
not a fan of the shot. I don't think he's as versatile as people are sort of projecting him to be, and
Yeah.
it really does worry me. Like we're talking about like tweeners. Like if I'm going to take a guy who I'm unsure can be a five, I'd take Derek Queen. I'd take Danny
Over
Wolf. I'd take guys like that over Asa Newell because it's just like I don't know what he is, but at least I know like with Darren Queen, I'm getting an offensive upside. If I take Danny Wolf, I'm getting a facilitator who can give me Kelly Olynyk type game. Like I can't even come up with a guy that like would make me feel like in an NBA context where Newell makes sense. That again makes sense for the Hawks. Like that doesn't mean he's a bad guy, bad prospect,
Exactly,
bad
yeah.
player. For us, I don't see it. And yeah, I'm so happy you brought him up because I would have been remiss to not mention him.
In my post that I had mentioned earlier about what are archetypes of guys that, in draft history that you did not like, and somebody had mentioned power forwards with little offensive game who are praised for defensive versatility. And I was like, this absolutely fits a guy like Newell, where he gets
Mm,
coined for being a tweener, which is not going to be favorable for him in the league. The versatility, like a name that, for example, that was mentioned was like a Pat Williams, where a guy like him
yep.
year 3, year 4 in the league, there's like, what is the semblance of his offensive game? What does he provide you? And I hate that I look at guys like that and they get rated so highly because it's always the intrigue, like, okay, a 6'10 guy that can handle the ball and have some face up game. But it's like, you're just, I would even say like a master, like a jack of all trades, master of none. Like none of
Yeah.
these qualities that he has are like NBA high level skills. Like again, a guy that a tweener that he's very athletic and above the rim athlete, but the shooting is lackluster in terms of because I was looking back at some of his tape because I had mentioned when somebody mentioned the little offensive game and the defensive versatility, I was like, let me go back and look at his Montverde numbers, and he shot like sub 40% from 3-pointer on like extremely low volume. And I was like, these shooting numbers are so inconsistent because like in his first 2 years
Mm,
at high school, it was like 19, 27%. And then in the last 2 years in Montverde, like it was just all over the place. And I'm like, there is like no consistent semblance of like the perimeter shooting, the rim finishing. And again, I understand the context he's playing alongside Cooper Flag, Derek Queen, but it's like you would see a lot more other skills pop out on tape when you're complimentary to these guys. And it was the rim
yeah.
protection was never there. And as you mentioned, like he's playing with a guy like Santos Ciro, who is just above the athlete, rim finishing, rim protecting freak of a nature of a big. It was at times where, as you mentioned, he's in situations that kind of limit his negatives and his weaknesses in his game. Even then, I didn't think he jumped out on tape and was somebody that was really
Mm,
intriguing. And for some reason, I've seen people mention him with the Georgia connection and saying, this is somebody to consider. And I'm like, you've had guys of his archetype, even lesser skill, or more skill in this case, relative to East Mill, for example, as you mentioned with John Collins. Guys like that made sense when all the skills that they had panned out. I don't think Asa Newell makes the best sense at all for Atlanta. Again, it doesn't mean that he's a bad NBA player prospect, but it's just for the context of what you guys have and what he lacks will not make 100% sense for what you guys need in Atlanta. I think a Danny Wolf, I think, falls in that same boat for a guy like Derek Queen, where you see the passing intrigue, but defensively, it's like, what do they show? What does this fit look like in the league as a four? Not as a five. I think that's kind of where I'm at right now with a guy like um, Danny Wolf, where he in theory should be a five, but I don't think he's gonna defend at a high enough level for me to feel confident in, and I
the
don't think,
wingspan and the he has no verticality either. So
but he won't be able to survive guarding fours. That's my issue. So it's like
no.
I'm at an impasse with him. This is where like Yaxel Landabur would have just been perfect because like he's just the blend of everything, and he gives you size, and he gives you defense and verticality on top of like everything in terms of finishing. So it's like I gotta pour one out for a guy like Yaxel, man. He was gonna be a can't miss guy. I loved him, but
Yeah.
I think for me, like somebody internationally that I've been looking at that kind of falls in that same boat, but at least they have some tangible skill that I'm at least feeling good about. Like for example, like a Bogoljub Markovic from
Mm,
Croatia who plays for Mega. A 6'11" stretch where the wingspan, at least for what is being reported, is like 7 foot, 7 foot 1, so nothing crazy in terms of differential, but a guy that high level shooter, a guy that can still handle the ball well at his size and being able to be, a really good transition threat. We got some showing of him at the Nike Hoop Summit, and he really performed well in terms of like the short roll passing and the shooting. But it's really just the defense when it comes to these kind of jumbo sized forward, tweener, center hybrids that when you look at these contexts, like these guys will not make sense in NBA context. And I think a lot of the prospects in this class will not fit in a context. Like, when I look at like Cooper Flag, a Derek Harper, Dylan Harper, Colin Knupp, a lot of these guys like Colin Murray Boys, like a lot of these guys are like surefire 16 game players. And then it's kind of like the rest of the pack where it's like if this skill develops, if they're able to kind of fit into their body, if they're kind of improve their frame, decrease their frame, maybe I can see the intrigue with that. But I mean, when you look at kind of the prospects, not necessarily just for an Atlanta Hawks perspective, but kind of just in that back half where you're considering at 22, I mean, I think you're just gonna have to nitpick what it is that you like and you don't like in certain prospects, specific to like front court. Like I know we didn't mention, for example, like Edu Thiero, where he's somebody that is a super out of the gym freak athlete wing that I had mentioned. Like I think this is the most athletic wing since the Thompson twins, and I was asking people about that, and I was like, I don't think that is wrong to say. I think he is the most athletic wing prospect since the Asar and Amen Thompson twins. But I mean, when you look at a guy like him, like he's another potential. Like if you do go Sorber at 13, is he somebody that at 22 where he's probably going to be available? Is he somebody that you're willing to kind of take that risk on in terms of he's a very raw prospect, but he with the athleticism he's able to kind of impact the floor defensively, of course, but also as a rim finisher, being able to kind of hopefully improve as a shooter. But I mean, at 22, if guys drop the way that you expect, I mean, you just hope that there's some surefire guys available, like you mentioned, like a Reynaud or maybe a Cedric Howard, guys like a Nee Clifford, Hansen Yang, like some of these guys were like after 22, the draft really gets confusing in terms of what kind of guys are they willing to take bets on. Because you're really just going to be like nitpicking with prospects because I mean, I don't know what that's why I'm so important on like with that 13th pick, you really have to take your game changer guy because this is the guy that is like setting the tone for the rest of your draft. Like if you go Sorber at 13, I think the rest of the draft kind of gets shaken up in terms of, where do you see other team pick? I think let me get the draft order. Like, for example, like when I was making my mock draft,
Mhm.
I had you guys taking Sorber at 13. So I have 11, which despite me, how I feel about this guy, like Asa Newell. I have Asa Newell going to Portland, Chicago number 12 to Murray Boyles. If you take Sorber at 13, I think this is where the quality of front court play severely drops. So I think that's where I'm really interested in seeing do teams trade up in this traditionally, maybe not necessarily super deep class in the back end? Do you start to see teams kind of couple these second round picks, some packages and saying, if we're not going to be able to get a guy maybe in the back end of the lottery or the draft,
Yeah.
can we reach out? And I think that was something where I think earlier this week or last week I was seeing like for example Atlanta at 13 was a potential for play to be traded. And I was like, this is crazy. I know some teams like in the back end of the teens, early 20s was considering like, is Atlanta willing to kind of if they're potentially going the direction of like, a Malawak or a Sorber or, some front court player, could they move off of that and kind of couple that with draft capital players? I want to kind of ask what did you feel like in terms of how set are you on terms of, trading out of 13? Would you look forward to trading up, back? Or are you kind of just set on not moving that 13th pick at least? Because I feel like 22 has a lot more sense to being moved because kind of the variability of prospects available at that spot and what does the draft look like in the back end of the first round versus at 13 where you probably could still get a marquee guy or some polished talent. How do you feel about trading within this draft versus like a next year draft where it's a lot deeper, a lot stacked at the top end throughout? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think the Hawks have to make at least one of these picks. And 13, again,
Mm,
in agreement with you, I think that makes the most sense. When I think about like the positional value, we talk about free agent classes, like Luke Cornett's unrestricted, Steven Adams unrestricted. The
yeah,
Pacers just made a finals run with their backup big man being Thomas Bryant, and I'm forgetting
Trace.
another guy. Geez,
Talking about the Pacers.
Not Tony Bradley. They have Tony Bradley and Thomas Bryant. Like those are guys who are fringe NBA bigs. And I'm not saying the Hawks need to take that same path. And I'm not saying the big man isn't important, but I'm saying
Hmm.
if the play and again, like the Hawks list should be extensive. You mentioned guys like Bolijup, who I could like I still haven't played, but like he's not something that I've like considered in my top 8.
Yeah,
They should have a plethora of options available to them no matter what happens at 13 just because of the amount of different ways they can go, whether it's big or wing. Like you have probably like the draft would have to go pretty catastrophically against the Hawks. And pretty much everyone, and this could happen just because the way the guards have so many questions. It could happen
hmm,
that no one takes a guard in the first 12 picks. And then maybe you
yeah,
might be like Chicago could go Sorber. And then now you might be in trouble. But
yeah,
assuming that doesn't happen, I think 22 is an interesting piece, but I do think guys like Brooklyn, I think Brooklyn trading up or teams like Utah trading up,
yeah,
that's probably more likely than us trading up. I also I don't know what prospect they'd be so in love with that they package stuff to move up. If they were to trade, it would be for an existing player. Like I've seen some Cam Johnson packages.
yeah.
I don't think he changes our future, and I do think I don't think he's like a huge needle mover, but he's talent. He's I think
Yeah,
he's McHale. I think he's I'm pretty low on McHale. I think he's pretty close to McHale's impact in terms of like I just think he's a better and smarter offensive player, and I also think like he's a little bit more physical. Like he's not the point of it. He's not. I don't think Mikhail is like anywhere close in terms of like one of the better point of attack guys. But I do think
Yeah.
Cam Johnson could approximate like a good amount of his impact for maybe 60% of the cost. And so I don't know if we have the. I don't know if I'd love that move, but there's guys like him. There's bigger fish that maybe the Hawks could chase that I'm not sure. Like if it's like the Giannis like seismic trade deadline thing, then that would be that would catch me off guard. But I think you probably have to package at least one, if not both picks. So
Yeah. I think
I don't
I
I don't think there's a guy they trade up for. Like I think unless like Colin Murray Boyle slides, but I don't think that's like a Quince. I don't know Saleh enough. Like I don't know which picks he's attributed for. Like the whole like Landry Fields versus Saleh thing is like there's only so many guys that Saleh picked versus Landry picked.
mhm.
I know they'll probably bet on versatility. I know they'll bet on relative size. Like that's kind of what they indicated when they took Bufkin and when they took Jalen Johnson and when they took Zachary Rizachet. Like those guys have been pretty consistent in terms of their archetypes. So I think
Yeah.
Cedric Howard is absolutely in play. I don't think they'll move up from him, but
Yeah.
I think it's likely that they stay. I think my most likely scenario is they stay put or they package 22 for like an established player.
Yeah, because I was seeing 22, for example, like I was reading some article from the SI on Atlanta, and they were saying that there's a potential way that you could trade 22 and like a slew of players like Terrence Mann, other guys, potentially 26 pick for a guy like Colin Sexton, to add to that backcourt rotation that you were
Mm,
talking about earlier, where I was like, if it doesn't cost too much, that's potentially a shot. But I think, as you mentioned, on 13, with kind of where you're at with the draft, and God forbid it doesn't, shit itself in terms of how people in the first 12 teams pick, you
yeah,
could still leave the draft with a marquee guy. And I think if you do stay put, the biggest thing is a lot of times, like around that draft time, teams will move themselves out of contention. And I think once you start to see for example, like Chicago, um, I think even potentially Houston, Portland, like these are teams that, probably don't go front court, specific to like a Sorber or like a relative to like guys that I could see them take potentially like, forwards, in terms of like the CMBs, the Noah
and
Singas.
it's in the same way in a Newell team probably for sure.
But I think like for example, like Sorber, like I think it's all contingent on Malawak. Like if Malawak falls, for example, to like ninth to Toronto, I think Sorber at 13 is like a full sale. I think you can go
Yeah.
ahead and make that stamp. And I think that's where you're going to probably start to see guards and definitely the wing start to fall off a little bit. And then maybe a potential for a guy like a Coward to be there at play for 22. Because I think guys that have super wide ranges for the most parts, if they're not like having like Bilal Koulibaly level, like rises of ascension on draft night, they're probably going to fall. And I think that's where, guys like him, Carter Bryant, like guys that get propped up so highly. But I think, sometimes these visions may not be shared the same way with, NBA front offices,
Mhm.
GMs. They probably do fall. I think that's where like you start to see, because for example, like at 21, you see a team like Utah. I think Utah's in a position where like they have a lot of wings and guards, but like it's like individual pieces, but they don't make sense with one another. And them potentially trying to move off of Laurie Markkinen, is there a way that we could probably see 21st get moved? Miami Heat, that they definitely need guard play at 2019. I mean, that's a Brooklyn Nets pick. Like Brooklyn Nets, they just need talent. I think they're just gonna go BPA. Washington at 18. If they go big men at 6, they could probably just go guard at 18. So I see like a lot of different scenarios where like your 22 pick is definitely more contingent on like how the rest of the lottery and late first shakes up. But I think 13, you should leave with a marquee player. If not Sorber, you could still put a high level wing or a front court player, for example, like as we mentioned, like a CNB and Nick Clifford. If Cedric Howard is there, potentially snag on him. So I think it'd be really interesting. I'm super excited because I think it's like the unknown, because after 1 and 2, it's like open season. And I think that's it's been a while since we've been in a draft, even especially with last year. Like I think we knew what kind of guys would go where. I think in a draft
Yeah.
that's a lot stronger than last season's, there's more variability in terms of how it's going to end up. There's a world, I think it was like 2 weeks ago, where maybe San Antonio might not even take Dylan Harper. They might not even use that pick. They might trade out of that. Now it's looking like they're going to keep it. But then what happens with Philly F3? Do they go Ace Bailey? Do they go VJ Edgecombe? Could they take a surprise and maybe go like Con Canepo, for example? So there's a world where like in certain team contexts, if the guy is just available, if you're drafting that high, do you go fit? Do you go BPA? And we've seen the poor teams go for fit versus BPA. Certain guys are going to fall. So again, I think 13 is one of those picks where historically, like, guys that have fell, supposed to be in that contention for earlier picks, but then kind of fall. There's a way that you could leave it a gem. So I think it's gonna be interesting. But I think life as an Atlanta Hawks fan, how do you feel like in terms of like long term outlook with your team in terms of your window for success right away, and then kind of long term in terms of like youth talent? Because I think with the kind of current crop of young guys that you have individually, with some of the pieces that you guys have, you feel very confident in terms of like Jalen Johnson hitting his high level outcomes, Zachary Shea having a very strong rookie season. He can become something if he improves in certain areas. Onyeka Okongwu definitely bursted out this past season, and was somebody that I was like, he should have been a concrete guy more so than a Capella this past season.
Yeah.
You hope for a Kobe Bufkin breakout this past season. I think there's, where do you feel like the current climate is for Atlanta in terms of, your current window right now, and with Trae Young especially? I think, with a guy like him, anytime he's on the court, you are a serious team. And I think that's one of the things where he's a playoff player. I think he's a guy that can win you a championship, maybe not necessarily as a one, who knows? But where do you feel like your current temperature is of this roster heading into next season? Even not even considering the draft, but I think just from a collective standpoint.
Yeah. I think there's been a transition in like my Hawks fandom where like I was like unsufferably delusional. You know what I mean? Like, and
Yeah.
and there was a point like, especially like when we traded for the Dejounte Murray, like I only thought about the positives. Like I didn't,
Yeah.
and I blame Spurs fans a little bit for that. But like nobody, like I also didn't have enough knowledge to really understand or like glean what defensive impact is. And
Yeah.
for like, I was convinced that he was going to be that ideal guy next to Trey, because I was like, we finally got that rangy defender who could, take the toughest assignment on the perimeter and shield Trey. And what remained constant was that Trey was getting the best defender on him on offense. And we're talking about a 6 foot, 175-pound guy drawing the Jaden McDaniels or the Alex Caruso's of the world. And no one saw, I think like only Dame saw tougher perimeter defensive assignments by the
Mhm.
opponent. And that's a very tough load to carry, particularly this season where he didn't have that established creator. As frustrating as a DeJounte experience was, you
Yeah.
could give him the ball and let him cook. It was disgusting offense, and it wasn't efficient, and it wasn't great on a per possession basis, but it was enough to give Trey a breather. And I thought this season in particular was challenging because we didn't have that, but it also forced guys to grow. And
Mhm.
I think they have established an identity, which is we're going to play fast. They were number one in transition frequency. They were second or third in total deflections. Dyson Daniels has completely changed the chemistry of this team because he is that level perimeter defender. And he also kind of drove the effort, I thought, of guys on the perimeter as well. And that's not something I was expecting from him, because it's a lot tougher to organize the defense as a guard, but also as a younger guard. And so for him to come in and have that impact in year one, I mean,
Mhm.
I was blown away. And he, like, legitimately, we haven't seen someone like him since like Mookie Blaylock. And Mookie was
Yeah.
like, he had great timing with his hands, but he was not that level perimeter defender. Like, we're talking about the guy who was second in isolation defense in the NBA, third in matchup difficulty, third in defense estimated plus minus among guards. Of course, led in steals and deflections by a massive margin. Set an NBA record for deflections per game.
Mhm.
He is my biggest source of optimism, because I'm seeing, again, I mentioned it earlier in the podcast, the turnover economy, his growth as an offensive player, the aggression.
Mhm.
I think where I am a bit more pessimistic than all the Hawks fans is our potential star outcomes for even a Jalen Johnson or a Reza Shea or Dyson Daniels. I think that we are, as a collective, underrating how much it takes to become a star. And Jalen
Mhm.
also was robbed of his first couple of seasons. Shout out Nick McMillan. I will never not slander him for not playing Jalen, because it was pretty
Oh yeah.
clear that this is a guy that we needed. Again, we talked about the lack of
Mhm.
playmaking versatility, the front court versatility in general on offense and defense was severely lacking.
Mhm.
And so this
Yeah.
this team was handcuffed for years by poor schematics from Nate McMillan, and then poor roster management. The young guys, DeAndre Hunter, John Collins, and Clint Capello, did not work in terms of flexibility, which put everything on Trey, which eventually came to a head in that Miami Heat series, which then led to the DeJounte Murray trade. And from those mistakes and then from that fire, you get Dyson Daniels, but it was their inability to recognize that they had to be a more versatile offense and a defense that like was really the sort of nail in the coffin, right? It wasn't the
Hmm.
Trey's inability to create, and it was the fact that nobody else was comfortable with the ball in their hands, and your front
Yeah.
court couldn't do anything to lessen the pressure off of Trey because not only could they not dribble, but they couldn't even run like dribble handoffs. Like it wasn't until Quinn Snyder came that I started to see bigs put in the slot offensively, right? Like
Yeah.
and Clint Capella, as inflexible as he is about his career, to his credit, like he tried to do that and he got better over time. But now Onyeka's slotted to be the starter. You have two lottery picks. We have one lottery pick, and then you have two firsts.
Yeah.
I think that the trajectory is a lot clearer. I don't think this front office will be rash like they were with DeJounte Murray, which like makes me feel good because I feel like if KD was a year or two younger, then maybe I might be banging the drum for KD. But I don't think we're ready to contend within his 2 to 3 ish year window, where I think he'll still be a top 15 to 20 ish player, which is what you'll need, considering what you'd have to give up, and then what you'd be asking from Trey. So, I mean, Trey's posting like I don't know if you've seen his tweets, but like he seems like
Yeah.
he's sort of in disbelief because I think the Hawks were linked to Siakam, and there's speculation that's why Landry was fired because he wasn't able to get that deal to go through, and it can be tough to see your peers succeeding. And I think, even as obviously someone who's not on the roster, like seeing the Pacers make the finals when they
Hmm.
were behind us in terms of a rebuild, Detroit taking the leap they have, Orlando is poised to leap us as well.
Yeah.
You're looking at the leagues around the landscape. Yes, the East still feels open, but there's also these younger teams that have took consequential steps
Yeah.
since we took so many backward ones since we made that Eastern Conference Finals. So I don't know. Like if we had a healthy Jalen Johnson, I think this team's is a 6 seed or a 7 seed. And I think that's a
Yeah.
consequential difference. But I
Hmm.
also think that even that last year's team was still too reliant on Trey. And ideally, you want to
Hmm.
run more offense to the front court. You want Dyson Daniels to grow into a tertiary or secondary creator. You want Jalen Johnson to polish up the handle. So there's still work to be done. But there's at
Yeah.
least an understanding and a vision of like, this is how we play modern NBA basketball, as opposed to like, we're just going to have Trey do everything. And I think that's like my biggest source of optimism because they've committed to a direction. And yeah, I think I'm enjoying. I wish I could go back to just enjoying like the young guys, developing. Like I think
Hmm.
there's a comfortability with just enjoying, like okay, this guy, he's pretty bad right now, but what could he be? Like the Hawks kind of have
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
weird pressure for a team that isn't viewed universally as a contender, and I think it's because of that ticking time bomb that feels like Trey, and his desire to win. I don't think he's the type of guy that would ask out, but I think I would understand. Like, I think this upcoming season, is where they have to show steps forward, and that could be. It doesn't mean like winning a championship or making the conference finals. It's more so like we need to be more consistent on a game-to-game basis. Like our record against teams below 500 was laughable. We blew 2 games to the Wizards. The Wizards won 12 games, or they won or 15 or 18. I can't remember how many they won, but like their first two
Yeah.
wins, like the first 3 months were against us.
Oh my God. I remember the tweets. I think it was like the first month where they were saying like we just basically took two off Atlanta. And I was
Yeah,
like,
and that
and
was their only wins. So that's like a emblematic of, again, like a younger team, but the Hawks were better in the clutch. They had a phenomenal record against the best teams in the East before Jalen Johnson went down. The clutch numbers
yeah.
were so much better this year. The
Mhm.
passing and the playmaking was all time great. They had the most games this season with guys shooting or scoring 10 plus points in a single game. So like the offense has never been more. Um, uh, I'm blanking on the word, but like it's never been more diversified and versatile, and that's what really it makes me excited. And I think the defense is more connected, of course, with Dice and all that. So long way to
Yeah.
answer to say, I'm excited where the direction is going to be. But I want to ask you, like, just to wrap up, is there a particular prospect, and I'll give my answer once you give yours. Like, is there a prospect that you feel like is your guy, that like you're higher on the consensus, and like someone that you feel like pretty confident in translating into whatever you think they could be in the NBA?
I think I'm gonna give two names. I would say number one would be Noah Penda. I think a guy like him, from what I've seen this past season, he plays for the Mans in France, 6'8", super rangy, wing slash forward combination. For me, I believe he's the best wing defender in this class.
Mm.
He's, as I mentioned earlier, he's one of the like singular hand people that can guard multiple positions, from 1 through 5. And I think when you look at wings, especially 3 and D wings, it's really like what skills do they have that differentiate them from other wings? And for Penda, it's really like the passing and playmaking skill that he has. For somebody that, is kind of his jumbo four that can get the rebound and being able to create for his team, for him, he's not necessarily the best of in terms of like off the dribble scoring, creation, but his off the dribble spot up shooting is actually very good. But I think one thing that really separates him from other wings in this class is the passing skill and being able to kind of really connect play on the perimeter at a high level. And that's something that makes me really kind of fall in love with him as a prospect because I already know what he does on the defensive end. When he was 27%, his defensive field goal percentage, specific to isolation play types. So for him, he's already a very strong defender, great help defender on day one, I presume. But it's really just what he does on the offensive end, which when you look at other wings in this classic, you kind of feel worried that there's some devoid skill that they have. Like, when you look at, for example, like Will Riley, like, it's somebody that you guys are in contention for, it's the frame, the defense, kind of the rim stuff. With that size, is he going to be able to do that in the NBA level? He's, a very high level shot creator, but what else can he do, especially at that size against other guys with, a lot more physical strength and length?
Yeah.
I think that's things where I would concern in the league. I mean, when you've got a guy like Carter Bryant, all-world defender, but it's really just the offense becoming tangible at the next level on good usage. Um, what Singay, super young, super raw, but he has a lot of tangible skills. But again, it's kind of just putting it all together. Me Clifford, he's somebody that kind of is a very scalable, multi-versatile player, but it's like he doesn't have like a one standout quality, and the length doesn't really necessarily translate to like being very high level at the NBA level. So I think it's like this is where there's an opportunity for a guy like Penda to, put his impetus in terms of like being arguably like one of the best defensive prospects in this class, but also what he does in terms of other qualities outside of his shooting, outside of his rim finishing as a playmaker and a passer that makes me really intrigued. And I think another prospect that I would say would be, see, the thing is, like for me, relative to where everybody feels about this guy, Con Knipple. I think for what people look at Con Knipple as like this 8 to 10 guy, I think he's somebody that is going to instantly bring top 5 value in his class. I think when you see a guy that can shoot the ball at how good he can, it's really the other things. I think that's what I look at with these prospects. It's like, what are the other skills that you have outside of like your standout quality? And with Con, it's, of course, he's a very high level shooter, but it's what he does as a strength creator and secondary or tertiary guy in some instances where he can initiate offenses. And there's times where, this past season for Duke when Cooper Flag was out, with his ankle injury in the ACC tournament, Con Knipple was pretty much veered as the guy that had to kind of step up. And, there was a lot of skepticism if he was going to be able to kind of score at a high level. Is he going to be able to create off the dribble, especially, going throughout the whole season, not having to be that lead guy. And he was somebody that ultimately won the ACC tournament MVP, scoring like 21 points per game on great efficiency. And one of the biggest things with him is it's the size. I think the size is something that I'm very confident in being able to like translate well. 6'7", but he's very like a stout 6'7". He's like 210
Yeah.
plus pounds. He doesn't have necessarily the craziest of wingspan differentials, but I was reading a tweet from, I can't remember, but it was an Asian tweet creator, and they're mentioning the benefit of 3 and Ds and just necessarily like sharpshooters having smaller wingspans when it comes to their load up of their shot and not necessarily having too much load up within their elbow because they have a
Mm.
smaller wingspan. And I was like, this sounds very interesting. This is when it was a clip highlighting, I think it was Con Knippel's 3-point shooting spot up combine drills, and he shot really well. I think it was like 21 or 22 out of 25 in the drill, and that was a mention. Like, he's 6'7", but like a 6'8", 6'9" wingspan. So people were very like thrown off by that. But I mean, for a guy 215 plus pounds, somebody that is 40% plus shooter on multiple different shot types and catches, shoot, guarded, unguarded, off the dribble, he's somebody that is definitely going to return top 5 value, at least to me personally. And I think when you look at what kind of teams are drafting in that range, like he's somebody that as high as 3, that could be somebody to consider. I mean, when you think about uh, Philadelphia, when you look at teams like maybe a Utah, a New Orleans, like these are teams that have maybe necessarily a number 1 in place, but he would be somebody that works really well as a secondary, tertiary guy. Of course, he's going to come in right away, give you the size, the shooting. I think the defense is definitely something that can improve in terms of his foot speed and kind of being able to be a twitchy guy, which he really struggles at right now. But it's really just everything else. There was times when I remember we were mentioning about a tweet that I made about Kaman Malawak and a lot of the assists that Kaman Malawak got on some of those lob threats. Exactly. And I was saying, for a team like Duke that, maybe necessarily didn't have like a traditional point guard, there was times where Khan had to be that pseudo point guard alongside like a Cooper Flag, which that's another thing where I feel like people don't get mentioned enough with Flag is the passing. Like these two wings pretty much have to orchestrate their offense at all times outside of like a Sion James, but it's really their passing so that kind of entices me. And I think as we continue to like evaluate prospects, there's like a lot of niche skills that like you look at wings and say this standout quality is going to allow him to be like a high level creator bet, a high level connective guy on the next level. When we were mentioning like big men, can big men pass? I think that's why there's so much more intrigue with a guy like Hansen Yang because of the defensive skill that he brings versus a guy like a Derek Queen, a Danny Wolf, these kind of other high level playmaking talented hub bigs, but they really lack in the important areas for a big man. So, I think there's a lot of prospects. And I think you could even add Hansen Yang to that list too. I think that's maybe I don't know if that's something that you're gonna mention too, but I think going through this podcast, like you could tell like there are so many guys that have such great qualities that I feel like, for example, in an Atlanta context, would really help you guys a lot. And when you look at your roster, like 4 out of your 5 starters are under 24. So it'd be really nice to be able to think of adding guys like this with a lot of connective skills that maybe not there's not much a lot of crossover with their skills, but ways that you can kind of just encapsulate these high level talents and their skill sets. And yeah, man, I think those two guys with Noah Con Knippel and Noah Pender really are like my standout guys and guys that I kind of have them a lot higher than maybe consensus of where everybody views them at. So what about you?
Yeah, I mean, you talked about Yang, definitely a guy that I view
Yeah.
as like a top 10-ish type guy in this class.
Hmm.
Looking at my board, I feel like I'm relatively higher on Malawatch than most guys. Thomas Sorber is definitely a guy that I'm higher on.
Hmm.
But I think a guy that I want to highlight is Walter Clayton Jr. I think he
Ooh.
got a lot. Obviously, he got a lot of buzz from the NCAA tournament, but like I was calling him a first round pick. I mean, it's not crazy early in the NCAA setting. Like it was like January, but I
Yeah,
mean,
he was
people
hooping.
weren't really saying that. Like, and I think he is every bit of like a backup point guard in the NBA who can give you that sort of like nuclear output from time to time without like bleeding too much defensive value. Like he's not a great defender, but like it's good
Mhm.
possession positionally. He's stout, strong base. Like I'm not saying he's gonna be like a menace like Jose Alvarado or like
Mhm.
a clearly positive small defensive guard like Fred Van Vliet, but I think he'll be somewhere between Peyton Pritchard and Fred Van Vliet, which is the damn good
Yeah.
player. And like
Mhm.
I think if you're talking about best shooters in the draft, I think he's second. I think Trey Johnson is number one just because like the shot versatility, the volume, the mechanics. Khan
Mhm.
would be third for me, not because he's worse than those guys, just more so like we didn't see as much like off ball threes or like pulling up off of picks. So like those two guys, like I think when we're talking about like a top 3 shooter in the class, a very polished player, of course, because he played so much time in college. I
Yeah.
think he's still almost being underrated. Obviously, there was a lot of bias. There was a lot of recency bias when after the tournament, but I
Yeah.
think he's like a top 20 player in this class. Um,
100%.
and then I think like another guy I'd probably talk about is I feel like Drake Powell, man. Like Drake Powell is another guy
Ooh.
that I'm
Yeah.
very interested in. I think he was pretty like that. I don't really know what Hubert Davis is doing at UNC, but I'm not. I think also playing with RJ Davis isn't easy, and
Yeah.
he was a guy who came in as a much more touted high school recruit and was sort of like thrust into a role player role. And I think he's got some special athleticism. I think he had the highest vert. I want to say he
Yeah.
did, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
Special
like
athlete,
42.
not as explosive as a dude, but I think like if you're talking about a guy that if it's later in the first round and like it's like 25-ish and then a dude's off the board or like all these other wing bets are off, like I would take Drake. If like I'm Utah, I'm ecstatic if I get Drake Powell falling to me. Like I think he's like that type of like in a buy low setting. Like he's not someone I would necessarily take for the Hawks because I do think he's much more of a theoretical player than like we can afford, but he's someone that I
Yeah.
really enjoy and I think he's still like was able to make things work at UNC. He didn't complain much, even though like during the combine, during his interview, he was like, "I feel like I could have done more, and I feel like I am more
Yes.
than what I showed at UNC." So I love that
Hmm.
mentality. And then I forgot to mention that for Maxime, but Maxime said something similar where he was like, "I know the perception of European bigs, and I'm not that, and I want to change that." And like I take
Yeah.
pride in that. And I would recommend anyone who hasn't seen Maxime play that watch him against UNC. and see what he did on the sideline out of bounds plays. Like he took it personal when he was hunted defensively. So I love seeing that.
Mhm.
Yang is also another guy. Like watching his tape, like
Mhm.
he would go at guys and he would be very emotive. Like there's one particular big in like the CBA that he clearly had beef with, and like he dunked on him and then like pointed at him, was laughing, and I was like, I love that. You know what I mean? Like that's the type of competitive fire that I think you're not born with, but you're also like you do need somewhat of that to be a dominant offensive player, and then sometimes even be a star. Like you have to have some sort of dickhead energy. I think like it's a
Love that.
requisite. Like it's part of the formula. You know, like you got to put it in the pot. It can't be too much because then you just like won't care about your teammates, but enough to be like, I'm better than you, and I want to beat you in every aspect. I think like it's necessary
Mhm.
to be like a top tier athlete. But look, man, I really, really appreciate the convo, man. Like,
Yeah.
I know this is short notice, but you know, like you got all this already on lock. It's already on the off the dome. So I
Yeah.
appreciate you so much for talking me through the Hawks, man. Like, I entered this draft pretty pessimistic about the bigs in the cycle. Like for me, it was really just Malawash and Sikorsky. Like those are the only guys. I was like, oh, you know, like no.
Yeah.
The more you get into the class, the more guys will emerge. And you know, I've spent a lot of time looking at the wings and the bigs just because I'm very Hawks focused. But I'm trying to
Mhm.
make my way back to the guards, and so I appreciate all your insights as always. And make sure you let the people know where to find you.
Yeah, man. I just want to first say thank you so much to David. I really appreciate you for even just being able to reach out to me and give me this platform to speak draft and just Atlanta focused talk with. And I think you're one of the best creators in this space. And I think it's always great when we have a chance to talk and get a chance to connect more on just anything related to the draft and basketball. And um yeah, man, I think I'm super excited. I think as you mentioned, like, coming into this class, I think you see the Cooper Flags, you see the Ace Baileys, Dylan Harpers, and then it's
Yep.
just the rest of the class. And then I think as you've kind of gotten a chance to immerse yourself in this draft and this cycle, you see a lot of names that could pop really well, and especially in an Atlanta Hawks context, guys that could really be impactful for you. And I think that's things that you get to look forward to. And hopefully in 3 weeks with the draft, I think you get to be really excited of what kind of guys when you guys turn that card in and are going to be really impactful players, hopefully one day for Atlanta. So, hey man, thank you guys so much. It's Mohamed. I think my at name's right here, MCF NBA, and thank you so much to Dave for hosting such a great podcast. I love all the work that you do, and I'm super excited for what's in store in the next 3 weeks, man. So yeah, check out our content, check out his content especially, and yeah, man, thanks, appreciate it, man.
Appreciate them for sure. And you know, we'll have plenty of draft content. I know you'll have plenty leading up to the draft. It's just a little bit over 3 weeks away, and it's about to be
So
that
crazy,
time. It's gonna
man.
be crunch time after the finals. So yeah, y'all enjoy.
Already.
Hope you all enjoyed the episode. Make sure you follow Mohammed, and y'all have a great rest of your day.